Wyoming Territory, 1886. Wind off the high country. The kind that carries pine resin and old grief.
Two figures on their knees in the road. Closer. They are not praying.
Nobody asks what becomes of the wood once it disappears inside that barn. Nobody thinks to.
Then in hoofbeats on Elkhorn Road, a man in a fine coat, a leather case across his saddle. He does not dismount any longer than courtesy requires. He surveys the sagging roof, the aging mule, the two women rising from the dirt.
The wind in that part of Montana had earned itself a name, the way a killer earns a reputation through relentless, undeniable work. They called it the Bone Scythe. It came howling down from the granite shoulders of Gallows Peak without warning, without mercy, slicing through wool, through timber, through the stubborn pride of anyone foolish enough to believe they had mastered winter in this territory. Old men in Briar Gulch spoke of it the way they spoke of rattlesnakes, with a quiet, practiced respect born from watching what happened to those who forgot its nature. It was the autumn of 1883, the year the earth seemed to turn its back on the living. The aspens had already surrendered their gold, standing naked along the ridgelines like rows of pale bones against a sky the color of a bruise. Briar Gulch sat in the shallow throat of a valley below Gallows Peak, a town of perhaps 200 souls clinging to existence through cattle, copper speculation, timber cutting, whatever the territory offered a person willing to bleed for it. The streets were mud. The buildings were raw pine planks weathered to the color of old ash. A telegraph wire, strung on crooked poles, connected the town to the outside world in stuttering dots, dashes, the occasional rumor dressed up as news. It was in this town, on a Tuesday morning sharp enough to split Firewood, that Wren Mercer stood in the back of a room full of neighbors, watching strangers bid on the wreckage of her life. She was 29 years old. Her husband, Amos, had been dead for 6 weeks, long enough for the shock to harden into something colder, something that sat behind her ribs like a stone she could not cough up. He had died the way he had lived, reaching for something just beyond his grasp. A lung infection, the doctor said. The real diagnosis was simpler. Amos Mercer had been a man whose dreams ran so far ahead of his means that his body simply could not keep pace. He had chased copper claims, cattle ventures, a freight-hauling scheme that collapsed before the first wagon rolled. Each failure left behind a promissory note, a handshake deal gone sour, a creditor with a long memory. When the infection finally closed his eyes for good, the debts opened theirs. The auctioneer was a man named Polk, hired from the county seat because no one in Briar Gulch wanted the job. He had a flat, nasal voice that turned every item into a small humiliation. The oak table where Wren had kneaded bread sold for $2 to the widow Greer, who at least had the decency to look ashamed. The cast-iron skillet, seasoned through 3 years of marriage, 75 cents, to a man Wren had never seen before, someone who had ridden in from a neighboring valley specifically to pick through the remains. The quilts her mother had stitched. The rocking chair Amos had bought her when they first moved into the house, carrying it up the porch steps with that grin of his. The one that made you forgive him for everything, at least until the next disaster. Item by item, the architecture of her marriage was dismantled, numbered, sold. The house itself went to Amos's largest creditor, a man named Crowder, who ran the assay office. He took possession of the deed with the efficiency of a man collecting on a bet he had always known he would win. When it was over, Wren stood on the porch of what was no longer her home, holding a small wooden chest. Inside it, Amos's pocket watch stopped at 3:15, a daguerreotype of the two of them on their wedding day, her face young, full of a certainty she could not now remember feeling, his folding knife, the bone handle worn smooth, her own clothes, 2 dresses patched so many times the original fabric was more memory than material. The deed, that single sheet of paper, was the last thing Amos Mercer had left her, his final grand gesture from beyond the grave. A parcel of land high on the stony eastern shoulder of Gallows Peak, a place the locals had called Mule's Lament for so long that no one remembered its surveyor's designation. The name was a joke. Everything about the land was a joke. It had belonged to Amos's Uncle Herschel, a man so deeply estranged from the family that most of them couldn't recall the original quarrel. Herschel had lived alone up there for years, doing what exactly no one knew, before dying in his sleep during the blizzard of 1871. The land had passed to Amos as the nearest living relative, a bequest so worthless that no lawyer had bothered to contest it. Amos himself had laughed about it, the one inheritance in the Mercer family that even the creditors wouldn't touch. The parcel was 40 acres of granite shelf, thin soil, wind-blasted scrub, too high for cattle, too rocky for crops, too exposed for timber. For 3 generations it had served as a cautionary tale in Briar Gulch, the kind of story men told over whiskey to illustrate the difference between ambition, which was admirable, and stupidity, which was fatal. Yet something gnawed at Wren as she held the deed, a question so faint she almost missed it beneath the roar of her own grief. If the land was so utterly worthless, a punchline, a cautionary tale, then why had old Herschel stayed up there alone for the better part of 20 years? What had he been doing? Nobody in town seemed to know or care. To them, Herschel was simply another Mercer fool, drawn to that cursed ground the way moths are drawn to a lantern circling, burning. She folded the deed, tucked it into the chest, walked off the porch for the last time. Judson Mercer was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps. He was Amos's older brother by 4 years, a man built along entirely different lines. Where Amos had been lean, restless, full of a nervous electricity that made him charming in small doses, Judson was thick, settled, deliberate. His prosperity was modest by Eastern standards, but impressive. For Briar Gulch, he owned a dry goods store, held interests in 2 cattle operations, sat on the Territorial Land Commission, his waistcoat strained against a belly fed by certainty. His eyes, small beneath heavy brows, had the permanent squint of a man forever calculating value. He removed his hat as Wren approached, a gesture of courtesy, so practiced it carried no warmth. His voice was low, calibrated to sound concerned. He had been waiting, she realized. He had timed this. "Wren, I want you to know I bear you no ill will over my brother's debts. Amos was well. Amos was Amos. But I want to do right by his memory. That land up on the peak, Herschel's old place, it's nothing but heartache waiting to happen. Let me take it off your hands. I'll give you $40, enough for a train ticket back to your people in Minnesota. You could be with your mother by the end of the month. Start fresh. No one would think less of you for it. $40. Wren turned the number over in her mind. A train ticket to Duluth cost roughly $12. The rest would feed her for perhaps 6 weeks if she was careful. After that, what? Her mother's house, which was really her stepfather's house, a man who measured affection in chores assigned, sewing piecework in a factory, the slow suffocation of charity, of being the woman who came home with nothing. She looked at Judson. His eyes were not on her face. They were aimed past her, up the slope, toward the rocky shoulder of Gallows Peak, where mules lament crouched in the wind. Something moved behind those calculating pupils, a flicker, quick as a trout in a stream, gone before she could name it. Hunger. Not concern, not charity, hunger. A question crystallized. Why would Judson Mercer, a man who inventoried every transaction down to the half-cent, who never made a move without weighing the return, offer $40 for a piece of ground the entire territory considered worthless? What did he see when he looked up that mountain? She did not know. But the hunger in his eyes told her something she needed to hear. There was a reason. The land meant something to him, something he was not sharing. Some dormant vein of stubbornness, a quality she had thought grief had scraped clean from her bones, stirred. It rose through the numbness like a green shoot through frozen ground, small but undeniable. I appreciate the concern, Judson. Truly. But I believe I'll hold on to it. His face changed. The mask of benevolence slipped just for a breath, just long enough. Beneath it was something raw, frustrated, almost angry. He caught himself, reset the mask, tipped his hat. His voice was still smooth, but the edges had gone hard. Winter's coming, Wren. That mountain doesn't care about stubbornness. Think on it. He walked away. She watched him go, noting the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. She had been right. She was certain of nothing else in the world at that moment. But she was certain of that. 3 days later, she spent her last $17 at Pickering's General Store. A canvas tent, military surplus, patched but serviceable. a shovel with an ash handle, a pickaxe, its head pocked with rust but the steel still sound, a heavy mallet, 4 sacks of dried pinto beans, 2 sacks of flour, a tin of salt, a box of matches, a coil of rope. She laid the items on the counter with the careful precision of someone who understood that each one represented a decision that could not be undone. Harold Pickering, who ran the store with his wife Maud, watched her from behind the counter. He was a kind man, round-faced, uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before him. Maud stood near the stove in the back, her arms crossed, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. The other customers, a cattleman buying tobacco, 2 miners picking up lamp oil, pretended to study the merchandise on the shelves while their ears tracked every word. Harold cleared his throat. "You're heading up to Herschel's old place, then?" "I am." A pause. Harold glanced at Maud, who gave him a look that communicated an entire conversation. He turned back to Wren. "It's no place to winter, Mrs. Mercer. Folks have tried. Herschel barely managed it, him being half crazy to begin with, God rest him. If you need a few weeks, Maud has a room above the store. We could work something." "I appreciate it, Harold. I'll take my supplies." He packed her goods in silence. When she turned to leave, she could feel every pair of eyes in the store pressing against her back, the weight of their pity heavier than the sack of flour on her shoulder. Outside, the wind coming down from the peak hit her full in the face, sharp enough to make her eyes water. She adjusted the pack, lowered her head, began walking. The trail up to Mule's Lament was barely a trail at all, more of a suggestion left in the dirt by decades of goat hooves, Herschel's boots, the occasional lost prospector. It wound through dense thickets of gorse whose thorns grabbed at her skirt, across fields of loose scree that shifted underfoot, past stunted junipers twisted into agonized shapes by the bone scythe. The higher she climbed, the more the wind asserted itself, moving from a nuisance to a companion to a bully, shoving at her chest, tearing loose strands of hair from beneath her bonnet. She crested the final rise near dusk. The land spread before her in the failing light, 40 acres of rock, thin brown grass, exposed granite ridges breaking through the soil like the spine of some buried leviathan. In the center of the parcel she saw the ruins. Herschel's old bothy, a shepherd's shelter really. Nothing more had collapsed into a heap of moss-covered stones. One wall still stood to waist height, leaning drunkenly against the slope. The rest was rubble overtaken by weeds. Slowly being reclaimed by the mountain, she dropped her pack beside the ruin, stood there, breathing hard, looking at what she owned, 40 acres of nothing, a pile of broken stones, the bone scythe curling around her like a living thing, finding the gaps in her clothing, pressing its cold mouth against her skin. Her chest tightened with a grief so sudden, so physical, it buckled her knees. She crouched among the stones, her forehead against the rough granite, feeling the cold radiate through her skull. This was it. This was the sum total of Amos Mercer's legacy, of her marriage, of every choice that had brought her to this moment. A monument to failure, the final joke in a life that had promised everything, delivered nothing. She let herself feel it, all of it. The loss, the rage, the loneliness, so vast it seemed to have its own weather. She let it tear through her the way the bone scythe tore through the gaps in the ruined wall. Then she stood up, wiped her face with the back of her hand, began pitching the tent. The tent went up in the relative shelter of the tallest remaining wall, its canvas popping in the wind like the wings of a panicked bird. She drove the stakes deep, piled stones on the guy ropes, did everything she could think of to anchor the flimsy shelter against the gale. Inside, she unrolled her bedding, a single wool blanket, a horse blanket she had found in the barn before the auction. She ate a handful of cold beans from the sack, drank water from her canteen. She did not light a fire. The wind would have torn the flames apart, scattered embers across the dry scrub. That first night was a negotiation with despair. The wind was a wolf, patient, methodical, circling her shelter, testing every seam. The canvas bulged inward with each gust, pressing against her like a suffocating hand. The cold was not an absence of warmth, but a presence, a thing with weight, with teeth. It gnawed through the blankets, through her clothes, into the marrow of her bones. She lay rigid, her jaw clenched to keep her teeth from chattering. listening to the wind moan through the tumbled stones of the ruin, a sound like voices, like old sorrows given breath. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, fractured. She woke before dawn to a sky the color of gunmetal, her body a catalogue of aches, the profound weight of her solitude pressing down on her like the stones of the ruined bothy. Morning established a rhythm, grim, necessary. She built a fire in the lee of the wall using the driest scrub she could find, heated water, cooked beans, ate them standing, her back to the wind, her eyes scanning the slopes. The most urgent problem was not loneliness, not grief, not even Judson's scheming. It was arithmetic. Winter was already in the air, a metallic sharpness on the wind, a brittleness in the morning light that turned the mountains into blades. The slopes were dressed in the dying colors of late autumn, drab browns, exhausted yellows, the occasional defiant red of a scrub oak clinging to its last leaves. 6 weeks, perhaps 8, before the first serious snow. After that, the world would close like a fist. To survive the winter, she needed 2 things: shelter that would not collapse in a storm, fuel that would outlast the cold. The bothy was beyond repair. She had neither the timber nor the skill to rebuild it. A new cabin was a fantasy. That left fuel. Firewood was the currency of survival on Gallows Peak, more valuable than gold, more necessary than water. Without it, the cold would kill her as surely as a bullet. The slopes offered little. The trees up here were stunted, twisted things, junipers, a few gnarled pines, clumps of mountain mahogany bent into tortured shapes by decades of the bone scythe. They were wood, yes, dense wood, good for burning, but heartbreakingly scarce. She spent her days moving across the rocky ground in a slow, hunched patrol, her eyes sweeping for any fallen branch, any dead shrub, anything that could be broken, carried, burned. It was work that paid poorly. A full day of foraging, sunup to sundown, her back aching, her fingers numb, yielded a bundle of sticks no bigger than a child's armload. Enough to burn for 3, maybe 4 hours. To survive a single night, she needed twice that. To survive a winter, the calculation made her stomach drop. She began working through the rubble of the bothy itself, prying at stones, hoping to find old timbers buried beneath. Herschel must have used roof beams, floor joists, something. If she could salvage them, she might stretch her fuel supply another week, 2 weeks. She worked methodically, clearing stones, stacking them, digging into the packed earth of the foundation. Most of what she found was rotten, soft, punky wood that fell apart in her hands, useless for burning. On the 7th day, the wind was particularly vicious. It came in gusts that staggered her, a physical blow that made her eyes stream, turned her fingers into wooden things she could barely feel. She was deep in the rubble, working at a large flat slab of granite wedged against the old foundation wall. It was heavy, she estimated 200 pounds, maybe more, seated in the earth like a tooth in a jawbone. She worked the blade of the pickaxe around its edges, chipping at the packed soil, creating purchase points. Then she wedged the shovel beneath one edge, braced her boots against a neighboring stone, heaved. The slab shifted, grated, tilted upward perhaps 6 inches, revealing a dark cavity beneath. She felt it before she understood it. A breath. Not the wind was at her back, tearing at her shawl. This came from below, from the opening she had just created. A slow, steady exhalation from the earth itself. Warm, not hot, not even truly warm by the standards of a hearth fire or a kitchen stove, but distinctly, unmistakably warmer than the air biting at her face. She froze, her hands still braced on the slab, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. She leaned closer, lowered her cheek toward the dark opening. Again that breath. Slow, steady, carrying with it a smell she recognized from somewhere deep in her memory. Damp soil, undisturbed stone, the mineral tang of deep places, of cellars, of the earth's hidden interior. She pulled back, stared at the opening, reached down with her bare hand. She had removed the gloves to get a better grip. On the pickaxe, held her palm over the cavity. The warmth was faint but real as the stone beneath her knees, as real as the wind screaming past her ears. The earth was breathing warm air. For a long moment she knelt there, motionless, while the bone scythe tried to tear her apart above ground. While 6 inches below the surface, The earth offered something that felt like a whisper. A memory surfaced not gradually, but all at once, sharp-edged, vivid, arriving with the force of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to make itself known. Her grandmother, Ida, a small woman with hands like oak roots, tough, gnarled, immensely capable. She had lived her whole life on the northern Minnesota frontier, near the Canadian border, in country where winter was not a season, but a siege that lasted 5 months. Wren had spent 2 summers with her as a girl, sleeping in the sod-roofed cabin, helping with the garden, listening to stories by the fire while blizzards turned the world outside into a howling white void. One night Wren could not have been more than 8. She had asked her grandmother why the cellar was always warm, even when the snow was piled to the eaves. Ida had wrapped both hands around her mug of chicory coffee, her eyes catching the firelight. Her voice was low, the cadence of someone passing along knowledge, too important to rush. The earth has a slow heart, child. Summer sun sinks deep into the soil, deep into the rock, deeper than you'd ever think to dig. When the sky turns to iron, when every living thing above ground is shivering, the earth still holds that warmth. It keeps a secret summer in its bones. Men build their walls, stack their wood, fight the cold like it's an enemy at the gate. Smart ones, though they let the earth do the work. They go down instead of up. They wrap themselves in what the world already gives for free. 8 years old, sitting cross-legged by the fire, Wren had filed this away as one of Grandmother Ida's many sayings, interesting, old-fashioned, no more immediately useful than her recipe for pine tar soap or her method of predicting rain by watching the behavior of ants. It was folk wisdom, the kind of thing old people said because they enjoyed the sound of their own certainty. Now kneeling on a barren mountainside at 29, her hands raw, her body exhausted, her future measured in dwindling sacks of beans, the saying detonated in her mind like a charge of black powder. The earth has a slow heart. She looked at the ruined bothy, looked at it differently, not as a collapsed shelter to be cleared away, not as a source of salvageable timber, not as a monument to failure. She saw it as a wound in the mountainside, a wound she could enlarge, a starting point. The idea arrived fully formed, terrifying in its simplicity, exhilarating in its audacity. Every homesteader on this mountain, every family in Briar Gulch built the same way. They felled trees, cut lumber, raised walls, shingled roofs. They built upward, reaching for the sky, then spent the entire winter fighting the cold that the sky sent down to punish them for the presumption. Their houses were boxes of dead wood, perched on the surface of the earth, exposed to every wind, every storm. They devoured cordwood by the ton, kept fires roaring day-night, burning through forests of fuel just to maintain the illusion of warmth against the relentless, patient cold. What if they were wrong? What if the entire premise was flawed? The earth beneath her knees was breathing warm air, not because of any fire, any furnace, any human effort, because the mountain itself was a reservoir of heat, a vast thermal mass that absorbed the summer sun, held it in its granite bones, released it slowly through the cold months like a coal bed that never quite went out. The deeper you went, the more stable the temperature. Every miner knew this. Every grave digger knew this. The knowledge was so common, so obvious, that everyone had overlooked its implications. She would not build a house on the land. She would build a house in the land. She would dig into the slope, using the existing depression of the old foundation as her starting point, carving a room out of the mountainside itself. The mountain would be her walls. The earth would be her insulation. She would wrap herself in the planet's slow, steady warmth, Grandmother Ida's secret summer, while the bone scythe screamed itself hoarse overhead. The sheer audacity of the plan rose in her throat, like a laugh, or maybe a sob. At this point, the two felt identical. It was the plan of a desperate animal, a badger, a fox, a creature that survives not through strength, but through the intelligence of retreat. She could already hear the whispers in Briar Gulch, see the shaking heads, the knowing glances. The Mercer widow has lost her mind, digging a hole in the ground like a gopher. Someone should ride up there, bring her down before she kills herself. Let them talk. Their conventional wisdom built drafty wooden boxes that devoured fuel. Their pity kept no one warm. Their charity came with strings attached to Judson's schemes, to the church's expectations, to the slow erosion of a woman's dignity under the weight of other people's generosity. She had spent her entire marriage deferring to Amos's grand plans, his bright ideas, his confidence that tomorrow would fix what today had broken. She was done deferring. When you have lost everything, your home, your husband, your standing, the future you imagined for yourself, something unexpected happens. The loss, once it is complete, once the last item has been auctioned off and the last door has closed behind you, becomes a kind of freedom. There is nothing left to protect, nothing left to risk. You are stripped down to the raw mechanism of yourself, the gears, the springs, the fundamental question, what are you willing to do to survive? Wren Mercer, kneeling in the ruins of a dead man's bothy on a mountain no one wanted, with the bone scythe howling overhead like the voice of every person who had ever told her she couldn't, discovered her answer. She was willing to do anything. She was willing to become the mole woman, the mad woman, the cautionary tale mothers told their daughters about the dangers of pride. She was willing to dig her own hole in the ground, because the ground, unlike the world above it, had offered her something no one else had. Warmth, without conditions, without pity, without a price. She spent the remaining hours of daylight clearing more rubble from the old foundation, working with a focused, almost feverish energy that the cold could not touch. As the light faded, she stopped, surveyed her work. The depression was roughly 8 feet across, perhaps 3 feet deep, where the original builders had carved into the slope. The exposed earth at the bottom was dark, rich, packed with centuries of decomposed granite. She pressed her palm against it. Cool, steady, alive. She climbed back to her tent as the stars came out, hard, white, pitiless in the thin mountain air. She heated beans over a small fire sheltered by the wall, ate them with the mechanical efficiency of someone fueling a machine. She drank the last of her water, made a mental note to find the spring Herschel must have used. Inside the tent, she wrapped herself in both blankets, prepared for the familiar torment of the cold. The bone scythe was picking up again, its voice rising from a moan to a howl, the canvas buckling inward with each gust. She closed her eyes. Something was different. The cold was still there. The wind was still there. The loneliness was still there, vast as the Montana sky. But beneath all of it, running like an underground stream through the frozen landscape of her circumstances, was something new. A current of heat, not physical heat, not yet, but the heat of purpose, tension, of a plan so insane it might actually work. For the first time since Amos's death, for the first time since the auctioneer's flat voice had dismantled her life item by item, her mind was not circling the drain of grief. It was building something. It was reaching forward into the future instead of clawing backward into the past. She thought about the Earth Lodge. She had glimpsed in a book at the Territorial Library a drawing of the dwellings the native peoples of the northern plains had built for centuries, dug into the ground, covered with sod, warm enough to survive winters that would kill a man in an open field in under an hour. Those people had understood what Grandmother Ida understood, what the settlers in their proud wooden houses had forgotten or never learned. The earth is not the enemy. The earth is the oldest ally. It was here before you. It will be here after you. Its patience is geological. Its warmth is a gift to anyone humble enough to accept it. She did not shiver that night. For the first time in weeks, the cold could not reach the core of her, because the core of her was burning with something the bone scythe could not extinguish. Tomorrow she would begin. She would not fight the mountain. She would join it. The next morning broke cold, clear, the sky a pale blue so sharp it seemed brittle enough to crack. Frost coated the scrub grass, turning the slopes into a field of tiny glass blades that crunched under her boots. Her breath came in white plumes. Her fingers ached before she had finished lacing her boots. The bone scythe was quiet for once, holding its breath, as if curious to see what this woman would do next. She ate a quick meal of flour cakes cooked on a flat stone over her small fire, drank melted frost water from her tin cup. Then she picked up the pickaxe, walked to the edge of the old foundation, looked down into the depression she had begun to clear. The task before her was not one of construction but of deconstruction. Excavation. She was not building upward into the sky. She was building downward into the earth. The concept was so simple it was almost primitive, almost embarrassing in its lack of sophistication. Dig a hole, live in it. The kind of solution a child might propose, a solution that any educated man would dismiss with a wave of his hand before returning to his blueprints, his lumber orders, his civilized assumptions about what constituted a proper dwelling. But Wren was not interested in proper. She was interested in alive. She began with the loose rubble, the smaller stones that could be lifted by hand. She tossed them down the slope where they clattered through the gorse, startling a pair of grouse into flight. Each stone removed revealed more of the old foundation Herschel's work, solid enough. The stones fitted together with a rough competence that spoke of a man who understood weight, balance, the way granite wanted to sit. She studied his technique as she worked, filing away observations, the way he had placed the largest stones at the base, the way he had used smaller stones as chinking between the bigger ones, creating friction locks that held without mortar, the way the foundation followed the natural contour of the slope rather than fighting it. Herschel had known something. The thought returned to her like a refrain. He had lived up here for nearly 20 years. He had not been a fool, despite what Briar Gulch believed. A fool would have died the first winter. Herschel had survived 19 of them. The larger foundation stones were a different challenge entirely. Granite blocks the size of feed sacks, some even bigger, weighing 200, 300 pounds. She had no levers long enough, no ropes strong enough to matter. She had her own muscles already sore from a week of foraging the pickaxe, the mallet, the shovel. Her process was agonizing. She would use the pickaxe to chip away at the earth packed around a stone, creating a narrow gap, a purchase point. Then she would wedge the blade of the shovel into the gap, brace her boots, heave with her full weight. Her back screamed, her arms shook. The muscles across her shoulders burned with a fire that had nothing to do with warmth. Sometimes the stone shifted a low, grating groan, geological, reluctant. That was her victory fanfare. More often it refused to budge, stubborn as the mountain it had been born from. She would reposition, chip more earth away, find a new angle, try again, fail, try again. It was not labor that rewarded speed or strength. It rewarded patience, repetition, the willingness to accept that progress was measured not in feet but in inches, not in hours but in days. Her hands were the first casualties. Soft from years of indoor life, cooking, sewing, the domestic work of a frontier wife, they had no defense against the rough granite, the splintered shovel handle, the constant abrasion. Blisters rose on her palms by the second day, white domes of fluid that burst under pressure, leaving raw, weeping patches of skin that stung viciously in the cold air. She tore strips from one of her spare blouses, wrapped them around her hands. The crude bandages lasted hours before they were soaked through with dirt, sweat, blood. She replaced them, kept working. By evening her body was a single continuous ache, a symphony of pain conducted by the pickaxe. She would stumble back to her tent in the failing light, heat beans over her small fire, eat them without tasting, the spoon moving from pot to mouth with the mechanical regularity of a pump handle. Sleep came not as rest but as a kind of collapse, a small death from which she emerged, each gray dawn feeling not refreshed but merely able to continue. She counted stones. She counted days. She tried not to count the beans remaining in the sack. On the fourth day she found the spring. It was hidden behind a tumble of rocks 50 yards east of the bothy ruins, a trickle of water seeping from a crack in the granite, collecting in a natural basin no bigger than a wash basin. The water was cold, clear, tasting of iron, of deep stone. It was flowing, which meant it was fed from below, from an aquifer, deep enough that it would likely continue flowing through the winter. Herschel's water source. Another piece of evidence that the old man had known exactly what he was doing. She drank deeply, filled her canteen, felt the cold water trace a line of ice down her throat into her stomach. Standing by the spring, she could see the full sweep of the valley below. Briar Gulch was a scatter of dark rectangles against the brown valley floor, smoke rising from chimneys in thin columns that the wind shredded at the ridgeline. Beyond the town, the territory stretched toward the horizon, rolling hills, distant peaks, the vast indifferent beauty of Montana in autumn. From up here the town looked small. The people in it, with their judgments, their pity, Their whispered certainties about the madwoman on the mountain they were specks. The realization was both terrifying, because it confirmed her isolation, exhilarating, because it confirmed her freedom. No one was coming to save her. No one was coming to stop her. She was alone with the mountain, the wind, the warm breath from the earth. Whatever happened next was between her, the stone, the shovel. She returned to work. By the end of the first week, she had cleared the footprint of the old bothy down to the original foundation level, a roughly rectangular depression about 10 feet wide, 6 feet deep at the back where it cut into the slope. The exposed earth at the deepest point was noticeably warmer than the surface. She pressed her cheek against it, feeling that steady, patient exhalation, Grandmother Ida's slow heart beating in the dark. Now she began the real excavation, not clearing rubble digging, cutting into the slope itself, carving a rectangular cavern straight back into the mountainside. The soil was dense, packed with stone, but after the first foot of frozen topsoil, it softened, became workable. Each foot she dug deeper, the temperature grew more stable, the air less sharp. The bone scythe, which ruled the world above, could not reach her here. 3 feet in, the wind was a memory. 5 feet in, she could hear her own heart beat. The stones she excavated were not wasted. She sorted them by size, shape, setting aside the large flat-faced granite blocks that would become her walls. Dry stone walling, fitting stones together without mortar, using their own weight, their own geometry to lock into a stable, formidable barrier. It was an art older than civilization itself, practiced on this continent long before any European had laid eyes on these mountains. She learned it the only way available to her, by doing it wrong, studying why it failed, doing it again. Her first attempts were clumsy. Stones she thought were stable shifted under their own weight, tumbling inward, once narrowly missing her foot. She studied Herschel's foundation work more carefully, the way he had angled the faces, the way each stone leaned slightly into its neighbor, creating a mutual dependence that was stronger than any individual piece. She began to see the logic, began to feel it in her hands, the subtle balance point where a stone went from sitting on a wall to being part of it. The earth held her. The work consumed her. Each morning she rose in the dark, ate, drank, picked up her tools. Each evening she collapsed into something deeper than sleep. The world above Briar Gulch, Judson, the whispers, the pity receded like a tide going out, leaving her alone on this strange shore with only the mountain for company. She was filthy. She was exhausted. She was in more pain than she had imagined a human body could sustain without breaking. Her clothes were stiff with dried mud. Her hair, unwashed, was tied back with a strip of cloth. Her face, when she caught her reflection in the spring basin, was gaunt, sunburned, older than its 29 years. She was also, for the first time since Amos's death, entirely alive. Not merely surviving, not merely enduring, building, creating, solving a problem so fundamental, how to stay warm when the world turns cold, that it connected her to something ancient, something that predated towns, commerce, the small cruelties of social standing. She was an animal making a den. She was a woman making a home. The two acts she was discovering were not so different. At the end of the 7th day, she sat on the edge of her excavation in the fading light, her tools beside her, her hands wrapped in bloody rags, looking at what she had accomplished. A shallow cave, roughly 6 feet deep, cut into the slope. 2 courses of dry stone wall flanking the entrance. The beginning of something. The bone scythe picked up as the sun dropped below the ridgeline, its voice rising from a whisper to a moan. The temperature plummeted. Stars appeared, hard white, ancient. She was cold, tired, hurting in places she didn't have names for. But when she held her hand inside the cave, palm open to the darkness, she felt it again. That breath, that slow, warm exhalation from the deep places of the world. The earth's secret summer, patient, constant, waiting. She smiled. It was not a large smile, not a triumphant one. It was the small, private expression of someone who has made a wager with the universe, who knows the odds are terrible, who has placed the bet anyway. Because the alternative, walking down the mountain, accepting Judson's $40, boarding a train back to a life measured in someone else's charity, was not survival. It was a slower, more dignified kind of death. Tomorrow she would dig deeper. Tomorrow the cave would grow. Tomorrow the mountain would give her another inch, another foot, another degree of warmth. She would earn each one with her own blood, her own sweat, her own unbreakable, unreasonable refusal to quit. The greatest fortunes are not built by those who conquer the land, but by those desperate enough to listen to what it has been trying to say all along. She picked up her tools, walked back to the tent. The bone scythe screamed. The stars burned, the earth breathed. Wren Mercer did not shiver. The second week began with rain. Not the gentle rain of the lowlands, the kind that coaxed wildflowers from meadows, but a cold, driving assault that came in sideways off Gallows Peak, turning the thin soil into a slick of mud, filling the excavation with brown water that she had to bail out bucket by bucket using the tin cook pot. It was miserable, demoralizing work, scooping freezing mud water from the hole she was trying to make into a home, dumping it downslope, watching it trickle back. For 2 days the rain did not stop. She worked through it because stopping meant thinking, meant doing the arithmetic of her situation, how many beans remained, how many weeks until the first snow, how far behind this weather had set her. Stopping was a luxury reserved for people with options. On the third morning the rain broke. The sky cracked open along the western ridge, spilling a pale, watery light across the mountainside. She was on her knees in the excavation, scraping mud from the exposed rock face with the edge of the shovel, when she heard hooves on the scree below. The sound was so unexpected she had heard nothing but wind, rain, her own breathing for 14 days that she gripped the shovel handle like a weapon. Before her rational mind caught up, she climbed out of the hole, mud-caked to the elbows, her hair plastered to her skull. A mule was picking its way up the trail, led by a man shaped like a fence post, tall, narrow, bent slightly at the top by decades of wind exposure. Oliver Hask. She knew him by silhouette before she could make out his face. He was the nearest homesteader, his farm a mile down the valley on the opposite slope, a spread of 60 acres, where he ran a small herd of cattle, with the grim efficiency of a man who had learned that sentiment was a cost he could not afford. His wife had died of scarlet fever 3 winters back. He had buried her behind the barn, built a fence around the grave, never spoken of it. He stopped 20 yards from the excavation, tying the mule to a juniper stump. His face was a geography lesson: ridges, valleys, erosion channels cut by 63 years of Montana weather. His eyes, deep set beneath brows like frost-killed brush, surveyed the scene before him with the practiced assessment of a man who had spent his life evaluating ground, livestock, situations. He took in the muddy pit, the crude stone walls rising on either side of the entrance, the scattered rubble, the tent flapping behind the ruin. His gaze settled on Wren, on her mud-covered clothes, her bandaged hands, the dark hollows beneath her eyes. He did not waste breath on pleasantries. "Woman, what in God's name are you doing to this hillside?" Wren straightened, pushing a strand of wet hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She was tired beyond any fatigue she had previously understood, sore in muscles she had not known existed before this mountain introduced her to them, hungry in the persistent, gnawing way that had become her baseline. She was in no mood to justify herself, building a house. Tolliver looked from the hole to her face. Something moved behind his eyes, a complicated weather system of disbelief, pity, reluctant curiosity. He worked his jaw, the way men of his generation chewed on words before committing to them. "That's not a house. That's a grave with ambitions. Ground here freezes solid 5 feet deep by December. You'll be entombed in ice before the solstice. Judson's been telling folks in town you've lost your faculties." A pause. His voice dropped half a register, losing its edge, finding something closer to genuine concern. "I didn't want to believe it. But standing here looking at this, I don't have a better explanation. Take my counsel. Pack that tent. Come down to the valley. The church will find you a situation, sewing, cooking, something. Nobody will hold it against you." She looked at her hands. The bandages were brown with dried mud, spotted with rust-colored stains where the blisters had bled through. She thought about the valley, the whispered conversations that would stop. When she entered a room, the careful charity that was really just control wearing a kind face, the slow burial of a woman under the weight of other people's decisions. Then she thought about the breath from the earth, steady as a heartbeat, warm as a promise. "I appreciate your concern, Tolliver. I do. But I'm staying." He stared at her. The weather behind his eyes shifted again. He had expected tears, or anger, or the brittle hysteria of a woman at the end of her rope. What he saw, instead, was something that unsettled him. More than any of those, a quietness, a depth of resolution that had nothing to do with stubbornness. This was not a woman refusing to face reality. This was a woman who had found a different reality than the one he was offering. His breath came out in a long white plume, stubborn as the granite you're trying to move. He reached for a sack tied to the mule's pack frame, untied it with rough, efficient movements. "If you're set on killing yourself up here, might as well have a full stomach for the occasion." He held out the sack. Inside, a loaf of dark bread, dense enough to serve as a doorstop, baked by hands that clearly prioritized function over artistry. A wheel of hard cheese, wax-coated, the kind that could survive a Montana winter without spoiling. A jar of pickled beets, the glass cloudy, the brine the color of old wine. It was, by the standards of Wren's current existence, an obscene abundance. He reached for his belt, pulled free a pair of leather work gloves, thick cowhide, creased with use, molded to the shape of hands larger than hers, but serviceable. "Your hands are a disaster. Use these before you lose the use of them entirely." He dropped the gloves on the sack, turned his mule without waiting for thanks, without looking back. His shoulders carried the particular slump of a man walking away from something he believed was doomed, but could not bring himself to abandon completely. She watched him descend the trail until the junipers swallowed him. Then she opened the sack. The bread was 2 days old, still firm, still fragrant with the yeast memory of a warm kitchen. She tore off a piece with her teeth. The flavor grain, salt, the faintest sweetness hit her with such force that she had to sit down on a stone, her vision blurring. She had not tasted anything but beans in 2 weeks. The cheese was sharp, crumbly, perfect. The beets were vinegar bright, their juice staining her fingers purple. She ate slowly, rationing each bite, making the meal last, tasting not just food but the presence of another human being who had climbed a mountain to bring it to her. The gloves changed everything. Not metaphorically, literally, physically, practically. They were too large, the fingers extending past her own by an inch, but the thick leather absorbed the punishment that her skin could not. She could grip the pickaxe without flinching. She could shift stones bare-knuckled against the cowhide without tearing new wounds. Her pace of work, which had been slowing as her hands deteriorated, surged. The gloves were worth more than money. They were worth weeks. Tolliver did not return to the site. He did not climb the trail again, did not check on her progress, did not offer further counsel. What he did starting the following week was leave things. A burlap sack at the bottom of the path, where it met the main trail, visible, deliberate, unmistakable. The first contained potatoes. A jug of fresh milk stoppered with a corn cob, a twist of dried venison. The next week, more bread, a small crock of butter, a tin of precious coffee that smelled like civilization. The week after, a wool blanket, heavy, slightly moth-eaten, smelling of cedar from the chest where it had been stored. He never attached a note, never acknowledged the deliveries when their paths crossed at a distance. Him on horseback checking his fence line, her trudging up the trail with a bundle of scrub wood. The offering simply appeared, regular as the seasons, placed at the altar of an endeavor he believed was doomed, but could not stop himself from provisioning. He accepted at them with a gratitude so intense it felt like a physical sensation, a heat behind her sternum that had nothing to do with the stove she had not yet built. She was still alone, but she was no longer invisible. The work evolved. By the end of the 3rd week, the cavity had grown to 8 feet deep, 6 feet wide. She was cutting into the slope at a slight upward angle, which allowed water to drain outward rather than pooling at the back. This was not intuition, it was the hard lesson of those first rainy days, when she had spent hours bailing mud water from a hole that collected it like a bowl. She had learned. The mountain was an unforgiving teacher, but its lessons, once absorbed, stayed. The soil composition changed as she went deeper. The first 2 feet had been frozen topsoil, dense with roots resistant. Below that, the earth softened into a reddish-brown clay packed with gravel, easier to work with the pickaxe, yielding to the shovel in satisfying chunks. Threaded through the clay were veins of granite, some small enough to pry loose, others massive, the bones of the mountain itself, requiring hours of chipping, levering, cursing before they surrendered. It was in the fourth week, digging at the back wall of the expanding cavity, that her pickaxe struck something that was not stone, a dull wooden thunk, different in pitch from the sharp ring of metal on granite. She cleared the soil carefully, using her hands, brushing away the packed earth the way she imagined an archaeologist might. What emerged was a wooden post, perhaps 4 inches in diameter, black with age, its surface hardened by decades underground into something closer to stone than wood. It was driven vertically into the earth, its top broken off roughly 2 feet below the current surface. She dug around it, found another 3 feet away, then a third. They formed an arc, curving away from her excavation into the slope. Between the posts, she found a ring of flat stones, deliberately placed, forming a circle roughly 12 feet across. At the center of the circle, unmistakable once she cleared enough soil, a fire pit, blackened stones, a thick layer of ancient ash, charcoal fragments that crumbled at her touch. She sat back on her heels, her pulse quickening. She was not the first person to dig into this hillside. Someones over many years had built here before her. The posts were the structural bones of an earth lodge, the kind of semi-subterranean dwelling that the Salish, the Crow, the peoples of the northern plains had constructed for centuries before the territory was mapped, named, divided into parcels that men like Wren Mercer could buy, sell, claim. They had dug into the slope, set posts in a circle, covered them with branches, grass, earth, creating a dome-shaped shelter that was half building, half burrow. They had understood the principle she was reinventing through desperation, that the earth insulates, that the ground holds warmth, that going down is sometimes wiser than building up. The discovery realigned something inside her. The doubt that had been gnawing at the edges of her determination, the persistent, whispering suspicion that she was in fact simply a grieving woman digging her own grave, went quiet. This was not madness. This was memory. This was knowledge so old, so proven, so deeply embedded in the relationship between human beings and the land they occupied, that it predated every assumption the people of Briar Gulch held about how a person ought to live. She was not inventing something new. She was recovering something forgotten. She left the posts in place, incorporating them into her design. They were too old, too fragile to bear structural weight. But they served a different purpose now. They were proof. They were company. Each time her resolve wavered, each time the pain in her body or the loneliness in her chest threatened to overwhelm the plan, she would press her hand against one of those ancient posts, feel the hardened wood beneath her palm, draw strength from the knowledge that someone had stood where she stood, faced what she faced, survived. Judson's visits began in the 5th week, timed with a regularity that suggested strategy rather than spontaneity. He would appear at the edge of the excavation, always from below, always arriving when she was deepest in the hole, maximizing the visual of a woman at the bottom of a pit, his hands on his hips, his hat pushed back, that smirk sliding across his face like oil on water. "Still at it, Wren? My, you've got yourself a fine cellar here. Going to store your vast fortune in potatoes?" His laughter was the exact temperature of the bone scythe. She learned to turn her back, to keep swinging the pickaxe, keep shoveling, letting his words break against her silence the way waves break against stone, noisy, briefly impressive, ultimately futile. Her refusal to engage infuriated him. He needed her to react, to crumble, to confirm the narrative he was constructing for the benefit of Briar Gulch, the poor, mad widow, digging her own grave, too far gone to accept help. Without her participation, the story lacked its essential element, the spectacle of a woman falling apart. His visits grew sharper, more pointed. He brought information like a man laying bait, heard from the land office in Helena. "Seems there's a question about whether living in a hole constitutes proper use of a homestead claim. A man might make a case for abandonment if he were so inclined. Thought you should know." She kept digging. The pickaxe bit into the clay with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. "Not even going to ask what that means. It means your deed might not be worth the paper it's printed on, Wren." Think about that while you're playing Badger down there. She thought about it. The thought set in her stomach like a cold stone while she worked, while she ate, while she lay in the tent listening to the wind. Judson was not bluffing. He sat on the Territorial Land Commission. He had connections in Helena. He understood the bureaucratic machinery that could grind a person to dust through paperwork alone. If he filed a claim of abandonment, if he argued that living in a dugout was not legitimate habitation, she could lose the land without ever understanding the legal mechanism that took it. The threat sharpened her focus, rather than dulling it. She had 6 weeks, maybe 8, before winter made the question academic. If the shelter worked, if she survived the cold, if the earth kept its promise, then no magistrate would be able to argue she had abandoned anything. Survival was the strongest possible proof of occupancy. She dug faster. By the 6th week, the cavity had reached its target dimensions, roughly 10 feet wide, 15 feet deep, cut straight back into the hillside. The rear wall was packed earth reinforced with the natural granite of the slope. The sides were a combination of earth, stone outcropping, her own dry stone work filling the gaps. 2 retaining walls, 3 courses high, flanked the entrance, framing the dark opening with a stern, almost monumental solidity that surprised her. She had not intended to build anything impressive. Function had produced its own form, the way water cutting through rock produces beauty without intending to. The floor was tamped earth, hard-packed, swept clean. She had dug a shallow drainage channel along each side wall, leading to a slightly deeper channel at the center that angled toward the entrance, ensuring that any water seepage would flow out rather than collect. The spring rains had taught her to respect water's patience, its ability to find every weakness, every low point, every invitation to pool, freeze, expand, destroy. Now came the challenge she had been dreading since the first day she conceived the plan. The roof, she had no timber. The stunted trees on the slope were too small for beams, too twisted to span a 10-foot opening. Lumber from Briar Gulch was beyond her means. She had no money, no credit, nothing to trade. She was left with what the mountain offered, stone. The idea was brutally simple. Find the largest, flattest slabs of granite on the slope, move them to the excavation. Lay them across the tops of the retaining walls, spanning the opening, creating a stone ceiling that she would then cover with earth, clay, turf. Simple in concept. In execution, it was the most dangerous phase of the entire project. The slabs she needed were scattered across the upper slope, deposited there by geological forces operating on time scales that made human history look like a footnote. Some lay half buried in the soil, their flat faces exposed to the sky. Others were stacked in natural formations, leaning against boulders, wedged into crevices. They were massive, the smallest she judged at 300 pounds, the largest closer to 500. Moving them downhill to the excavation, positioning them precisely atop the walls, a single mistake, a single miscalculation of weight, balance, trajectory, would crush her. It was during her survey of the upper slope, searching for suitable slabs, that she found the cave. Not a cave, exactly more of an overhang, a deep recess in the granite face where a massive boulder had split from the cliff centuries ago, creating a sheltered space about the size of a small room. What stopped her was not the space itself, but what was inside it. Tools. A rusted iron pry bar, 5 feet long, its tip flattened into a chisel edge. A block and tackle rig, the rope rotted to fibers, but the iron pulleys still intact, still functional. A hand-forged hammer, its head pitted with rust, but solid, its handle long since gone. Scattered among these, half buried in accumulated dirt, iron spikes, drill bits, a broken lantern, the corroded remnants of a tin lunch pail. Mining equipment. Someone had been prospecting on this slope systematically, seriously, with proper tools. Not Herschel, whose bothy had been a simple shepherd's shelter. Someone else. Someone with knowledge, equipment, purpose. She picked up the pry bar, felt its weight, its balance. It was a lever, exactly what she needed, exactly what she had lacked. The pulleys, if she could rig new rope through them, would multiply her pulling force several times over. She carried every piece of salvageable equipment back to the excavation, making 3 trips. The pry bar alone transformed her capability. It was long enough, strong enough to lever stones that the shovel could not budge. She could wedge it beneath a granite slab, place a smaller stone as a fulcrum, bear down with her full weight physics, doing the work that muscle alone could not. But the largest slabs remained beyond her. She could lever them, shift them inches at a time, but moving them the 30, 40, 50 yards downslope to the excavations was a project that would take weeks of solo effort. Each slab would need to be inched along on improvised log rollers cut from the largest juniper trunks she could find, a glacial process of lever roll, reposition, lever again. She had managed to move 2 slabs, the 2 smallest, each roughly 300 pounds to the edge of the excavation by the end of the 7th week. It had taken 9 days. Her shoulders felt like they had been disassembled, reassembled incorrectly. The log rollers, green juniper trunks no thicker than her wrist, kept splitting under the weight. She needed 3 more slabs, the 3 largest, to complete the roof span. At her current pace, that would take another 3 weeks. She did not have 3 weeks. The first snow could come any day. The morning frost was lasting longer each day, the ice on the spring growing thicker. She swallowed what remained of her pride, walked down the mountain, found Tolliver mending fence at the south edge of his property. He saw her coming, set down the hammer, waited. His face gave away nothing except the weathering. "I need to borrow your mule. 3 days, maybe 4. I'm trying to move stone for a roof." A stone roof. Not a question, a statement delivered with the flatness of a man who has stopped being surprised by the universe. "Granite slabs. I've got a pry bar rollers. The mule can drag what I can't carry. I'll return her fed, watered, sound." Tolliver looked at her for a long time. His eyes tracked to her hands still wearing his gloves, the leather now dark with use, to her face thinner than the last time he'd seen her up close, to her boots, the soles nearly worn through. "You're going to put 1,000 pounds of rock on top of a hole in the ground, then crawl underneath it. That's the general idea." Something happened then that Wren had not anticipated. Tolliver Hask, a man who rationed his expressions the way a miser rations coin, almost smiled. It was not a smile of amusement. It was the involuntary recognition of something that exceeded his ability to categorize: admiration, bafflement, resignation, all compressed into a single twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Her name's Barley. She bites when she's impatient, so don't dawdle." He walked to the barn without further discussion, emerged leading a dun-colored mule with intelligent eyes, scarred knees, the broad chest of an animal bred for pulling stumps from Montana clay. He handed Wren the lead rope, turned back to his fence. "Tolliver." He stopped. "Thank you." His back was to her. His voice when it came was rough as the bark on a lodgepole pine. "Don't thank me. Just don't get yourself killed under a pile of rocks. I don't want that on my conscience." Barley was a revelation. What had taken Wren days to accomplish alone, the mule accomplished in hours. Rigged with the block and tackle pulleys, threaded with new rope, Wren had braided from strips of canvas. Barley dragged the 3 remaining granite slabs down the slope one at a time, her hooves finding purchase on the loose scree with the sure-footed competence of an animal that had spent its entire life on terrain designed to break ankles. Wren guided each slab with the pry bar, steering, braking, controlling the descent with a precision born from fear, the certain knowledge that a runaway slab would destroy the walls she had spent weeks building. The positioning was the most dangerous part. Each slab had to be levered up onto the tops of the retaining walls, slid across the opening, settled into place. She built ramps of packed earth, used Barley's pulling power to drag the slabs up the ramps, then knocked the ramps away, allowing the slabs to drop the final inches into position. The ground shook with each placement. Dust rose from the cavity. Once a slab slipped sideways as it settled, grinding against the wall stones with a sound like breaking bones, shifting the entire top course 3 inches. She spent a day repacking the displaced stones, reinforcing the wall, her hands shaking with residual adrenaline. 5 slabs, laid across the walls, spanning the 10-foot opening, their edges touching imperfectly, leaving gaps, cracks of sky visible from inside the cavity, thin lines of light in the stone ceiling. She spent another week filling these gaps with smaller stones, chinked with clay mixed to a thick paste using water from the spring. Stone layer. She packed a foot of the reddish clay she had excavated, tamping it with the mallet until it was dense, almost ceramic. Over the clay she laid strips of turf, cut from the slope with the shovel. The grass roots knitting into a living membrane that would shed rain, hold soil, gradually become indistinguishable from the surrounding hillside. She returned barley, led the mule down the trail on a morning so cold her breath hung in the air like smoke signals. Tolliver took the lead rope, inspected the mule hooves, legs, teeth with the professional eye of a man who valued his livestock above most human company. Finding no damage, he nodded once, turned away. Tolliver, he looked back. The earth does hold warmth. My grandmother was right, I can feel it. It works. His expression did not change, but something shifted in the way he held his shoulders, a fractional relaxation, as if a weight he had been carrying had been reduced by a small, measurable amount. Your grandmother sounds like she had more sense than most of the men in this territory. He walked his mule into the barn. The conversation was over. 3 days later, the rain came back. Not the cold, driving rain of October, but something different, a sustained, heavy downpour, the kind that the old-timers in Briar Gulch called a gully washer, a storm that could move more earth in a night than a crew of men could move in a week. It started at dusk, escalating from steady to torrential within an hour. By full dark, the mountainside was running with water, every depression becoming a stream, every slope becoming a chute. Wren lay in her tent, listening to the roar. She had not yet moved into the shelter. The interior was unfinished, the entrance still open to the elements, the drainage channels untested under heavy load. She should have been in there, she realized. She should have prioritized the entrance, the door, the final weatherproofing. Instead, she had returned the mule, taken a day to rest, a luxury she could not afford, paid for now in the currency of anxiety. The sound woke her at 3 in the morning. Not the rain, which had been a constant drumming for hours. Something beneath the rain, a low, grinding vibration that she felt through the ground before she heard it. A geological sound, the sound of earth moving. She was out of the tent in seconds, barefoot, the rain hitting her like a wall of cold needles. In the darkness, she could see almost nothing. She scrambled toward the excavation, slipping on the mud, catching herself on stones. Lightning flashed, a single strobe of blue-white light that froze the scene for a heartbeat. The east wall had collapsed. The sustained rain had saturated the soil above the excavation, the weight of the waterlogged earth exceeding the capacity of the dry stone retaining wall. The top 2 courses had buckled inward, spilling stones, mud, a torrent of brown water into the cavity. Half the floor was buried under debris. One of the roof slabs had shifted, not fallen, not yet, but tilted at an angle that spoke of imminent, catastrophic failure. She stood in the rain, staring at the wreckage. Lightning flashed again. In that second of illumination, she saw the full scope of the damage, weeks of labor undone in minutes, the patient work of her hands dismantled by a force so vastly superior to her own that resistance seemed not just futile but absurd. The rain hammered her skull, ran down her face in streams. She could not distinguish from the tears that had started without her permission. She did not go back to the tent. She sat down in the mud beside the ruined wall, her knees drawn to her chest, her arms wrapped around them, the rain pouring over her as if trying to wash her off the mountain entirely. The cold was savage. It reached through her wet clothes, through her skin, into the place where her determination lived. She felt it waver. For the first time since she had started digging, the flame that had sustained her, the heat of purpose, of defiance, of the earth's secret summer guttered. The voice in her head was not Judson's. It was her own, a quiet, reasonable voice that laid out the facts without cruelty, without judgment. The wall collapsed. You don't have the materials to rebuild it properly. Winter is 2 weeks away, maybe less. You have no door, no stove, no way to seal the entrance. Tolliver's charity won't last forever. Judson is filing papers in Helena. You are sitting in the mud on a mountain that has been killing people's ambitions for 100 years. The rational move, the sane move, is to walk down the trail at first light. Find Tolliver. Ask him to drive you to the train station. She sat with it. Let the voice finish. Let the logic complete its circuit. Then she thought about the ancient posts, the earth lodge that had stood on this spot, built by people with less technology than she possessed, people who had survived winters that would have killed every soul in Briar Gulch. Their shelter had collapsed too. Eventually, everything does, given enough time. But someone had built it. Someone had lived in it. Someone had proven that the principle was sound. The wall had collapsed because of a flaw. She could identify insufficient drainage above the excavation. The rain had pooled on the slope above the shelter, saturating the soil, creating hydraulic pressure the wall was never designed to resist. The solution was not stronger walls. The solution was diversion, a trench dug above the shelter, upslope, channeling rainwater around the excavation before it could accumulate. A problem she could solve. A flaw she could correct. The earth had not betrayed her. She had failed to listen carefully enough. The lesson was not that the plan was wrong. The lesson was that the plan was incomplete. She stood up. Her body protested, every joint stiff, every muscle cold-locked, her left hand throbbing where a falling stone had struck it during the collapse, the knuckles swollen, 2 fingers refusing to close. She could not tell if they were broken. It did not matter. She could dig with one hand if she had to. A person does not discover what she is made of in the moments when things go right. She discovers it in the mud, in the dark, at 3 in the morning, when the thing she built is broken, when the voice of reason is telling her to quit, when the only thing standing between her decision to stay or go is a question so simple it could fit on a headstone. Am I finished? Wren Mercer, standing in the rain on a mountain that had just tried to bury her work, answered the question with her body. She picked up the shovel. She began digging the drainage trench. She worked through the rest of the night. By dawn, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, then stopped. The sky cleared with the sudden, almost theatrical generosity that Montana weather occasionally displayed, as if embarrassed by its own violence. Golden light poured across the mountainside, steaming the wet earth, turning the puddles into mirrors. She had dug a trench 18 inches deep, 4 feet wide, arcing above the excavation in a crescent that directed water to either side, away from the shelter. Her left hand had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. 2 fingers were definitely broken. She could feel the grinding of bone on bone when she tried to flex them. She bound them together with a strip of cloth, splinting them against each other, the pain a bright, insistent signal she could not afford to obey. The rebuilding took 10 days. She cleared the debris from inside the cavity first, hauling the fallen stones out one by one with her good hand, the pry bar, sheer belligerence. Then she rebuilt the east wall, this time with a crucial modification. She angled the base stones inward, creating a slight batter, a lean back that directed the weight of the wall into the slope rather than away from it. She had seen this technique in Herschel's original foundation, The Old Man Again, proving smarter than she had given him credit for. The rebuilt wall was shorter by 1 course, but vastly more stable, its geometry working with gravity instead of against it. She re-leveled the shifted roof slab using the pry bar as a lever, her broken fingers screaming with each adjustment, repacked the clay seal, relaid the turf, dug supplementary drainage channels on both sides, packed the floor with fresh gravel from the scree field, tamping it until it was level, firm, almost comfortable underfoot. The entrance was next. She needed a door. She had no lumber, no hinges, no hardware. What she had were the packing crates her supplies had come in, thin pine boards, rough cut, held together with iron nails. She pried them apart carefully, saving every nail, straightening the bent ones on a flat stone. The boards were narrow, barely 6 inches wide, but by laying them side by side she could span the entrance opening. She braced them with cross pieces cut from the thickest juniper branches she could find, nailing them in place with the salvaged nails, creating a door that was ugly, imperfect, full of gaps but solid enough to block the wind. The gaps she stuffed with rags, canvas, dried grass, anything that could serve as insulation. She hung the door on improvised hinges, strips of leather cut from the damaged edge of her tent, looped around nails driven into the door frame. It swung stiffly, scraped against the stone threshold, required lifting slightly to close. It was the most beautiful door she had ever seen. Inside, the space was transformed. With the entrance sealed, the wind the omnipresent, soul-eroding bone scythe was reduced to a distant murmur, a rumor of the world outside. The air was still, cool but not cold, holding that steady cellar temperature she had felt from the first moment she had lifted the granite slab weeks ago. She lit a candle, her first candle inside the shelter, watched the flame. It burned straight, unwavering, without the faintest tremor, no draft, no infiltration. The earth had sealed her in its slow embrace. The stove came next. She had found a rusted metal drum half buried in the gorse on the south slope, a relic of some forgotten supply cache. It was dented, corroded, missing its top, but structurally sound, the iron thick enough to contain a fire without burning through. She cut an opening in one side with a pickaxe, fashioned a grate from iron spikes laid across the interior, built a chimney from stacked flat stones mortared with clay, running it up through a gap she had left in the roof for this purpose. The chimney drew imperfectly, smoke leaked from the clay joints, filling the upper part of the shelter with a haze that made her eyes water, but it worked. The fire drew. The heat contained within the iron drum radiated into the small space with an efficiency that startled her. She realized within the first hour of having a lit stove that the fire was almost unnecessary. The earth itself was providing the baseline warmth. The stove merely raised the temperature from cool to comfortable. In a wooden house on the surface, the fire was the entire heating system, fighting a constant losing battle against the wind, the drafts, the thin walls. Here underground, the fire was a supplement, a luxury. A few sticks of scrub wood, the kind of meager fuel that would have been laughable in a surface dwelling, kept her shelter warm for hours. She built a bed frame from juniper branches lashed together with rope. A sleeping platform raised a foot off the floor to take advantage of the warmer air that collected at mid-height. A table, a stool, both crude, both functional. She moved her bedding inside, her supplies, her small wooden chest with Amos's effects. She took down the tent. It was too damaged from the weeks of wind to serve as shelter, but the canvas was useful as insulation, draped over the door, layered on the bed. On the evening she finished, she sat on her stool, her back against the earthen wall, a cup of coffee, Tolliver's gift, warming her good hand. The candle on the table burned without flicker. The stove ticked quietly as its iron cooled. Outside, she could hear the bone scythe prowling the ridgeline, its voice reduced by 3 feet of earth, stone, turf to a murmur so faint it could have been the purring of a distant cat. She was warm in November, on Gallows Peak, in a house that was invisible from 30 yards, that used a fraction of the fuel her neighbors consumed, that was heated primarily by the patient, ancient, inexhaustible warmth of the earth itself. The woman who builds her house in the path of the storm will spend her life repairing it. The woman who builds her house inside the mountain will spend her evenings drinking coffee. She almost laughed. Almost. The broken fingers throbbed. The loneliness was still there, a companion she could not evict. But the fear, the specific ice-cold fear of freezing to death on this mountain, had been replaced by something else. Confidence was too strong a word. Call it evidence. Call it the accumulated weight of every stone she had moved, every wall she had built, every problem she had solved. The earth worked. Grandmother Ida had been right. The ancient builders had been right. She was right. Below in Briar Gulch, the narrative had taken hold. Judson Mercer had done his work thoroughly, seeding the story in the saloon, at the general store, after church services. The Mercer widow had gone mad with grief. She was living in a hole in the ground up on Mule's Lament, digging like an animal, eating scraps. Someone should do something. He implied the emphasis always on someone else, never on himself. The townspeople, who had their own preparations to worry about, their own firewood to stack, their own roofs to patch, absorbed the story with the passive appetite of people who enjoy tragedy at a comfortable distance. They called her the Mole Woman. The name stuck the way names do in small towns, casually, permanently, without malice, but without mercy. Judson had also been busy in Helena. He had written to the Territorial Land Office, citing Section 12 of the Homestead Provisions, the clause requiring visible improvement consistent with habitation as a condition of deed validity. His argument, a hole in the ground did not constitute visible improvement. The land was effectively abandoned. As the nearest family claimant, he was petitioning for transfer of the deed. A hearing had been scheduled for early spring after the winter break. The machinery of dispossession was in motion, grinding slowly, grinding fine. He mentioned this to her on his last visit before the snow. Standing at the edge of her now invisible shelter, the turf roof had blended so completely with the surrounding slope that he had nearly walked over it without seeing it. She was inside, heard his boots on the turf above her head, emerged through the low doorway to find him staring at the spot where a building should have been, his face registering a confusion that briefly cracked his composure. "Where in the what did you do?" She said nothing. Waited. He recovered. The smirk returned, though it sat less comfortably now. "I've filed a claim with the territorial office. Abandonment provision. A hearing in April. You should know that living in a gopher den isn't going to impress a judge, Wren. This was never going to work. Sell me the deed. I'll give you 60 now, 20 more than before. Call it a final offer. $60. He had raised his price. The hunger in his eyes had not diminished. If anything, it had intensified, sharpened by frustration. She thought about the mining tools in the cave, the prospectors who had been here before, the way Judson's gaze always drifted upslope, past her, toward the ridge where the granite was veined with something she had not yet identified, greenish streaks in the rock face, a mineral discoloration she had noticed while quarrying roof slabs but had been too busy to investigate. $60 for land he wanted badly enough to commit legal fraud. The mathematics of that desperation told her everything she needed to know. "The land isn't for sale, Judson. Not for 60. Not for 600. You know why you want it. I don't. Not yet. But I intend to find out." His face went white. Not with anger, with something closer to alarm. She had stumbled onto something. The words "I intend to find out" landed like a threat he had not anticipated, piercing a vulnerability he had assumed was invisible. He left without another word, his pace faster than dignity would normally permit. She watched him descend the trail, filing away his reaction the way she filed away useful stones for later use. When the time came to build something with it, the days shortened. The mornings arrived later, colder, edged with a frost that lingered until noon. The slopes above the tree line turned white, then the slopes below. The aspens, those that still held leaves, released them in a final windswept surrender, the gold coins spinning down to be buried in the first dustings of snow. The world was contracting, pulling inward, preparing for the siege. Wren prepared with it. She spent her days foraging the last of the available firewood, breaking dead scrub from the slopes, dragging fallen juniper limbs to her shelter, building a woodpile inside the entrance alcove where it would stay dry. The pile was small by the standards of Briar Gulch, where families stacked cordwood in walls that reached their eaves. She estimated 3 weeks' worth of fuel, maybe 4 if she burned sparingly. In a normal house, that would be suicide. In her shelter, where the earth provided the baseline heat, where the stove was a supplement rather than a lifeline, she calculated it would be enough. She had to believe it would be enough because there was no more to be had. She sealed every crack in the door with additional layers of rags, canvas, dried moss. She banked earth against the outside of the entrance walls, creating a windbreak. She stacked stones in a low barrier across the approach path, a snow fence that would cause drifts to accumulate before reaching her door rather than against it. Each precaution was small. Together they constituted a defense system designed not to defeat winter, but to redirect it, to persuade it to spend its fury elsewhere while she waited, warm, patient, inside the mountain's embrace. The last day of autumn, she knew it by the feel of the air, not by any calendar. The sky changed. It did not darken gradually the way normal cloud cover arrived. It thickened, as if the atmosphere itself were curdling, turning from blue to gray to a strange, oily pewter that seemed to press down on the peaks, like a lid being lowered over a pot. The bone scythe, which had been gusting all morning, fell silent. The silence was worse than the wind. It was the silence of a held breath, of a coiled spring, of a predator in the instant before it launches. Every living thing on the mountain recognized it. The birds vanished, not gradually, but all at once, as if swept from the sky by an invisible hand. The rabbits went to ground. Even the insects, the last few hardy beetles she had seen crawling across the stones, disappeared. The mountain emptied of everything except Wren, the silence, the terrible pewter sky. She stood outside her shelter, looking up. The clouds had a texture she had never seen, greasy, dense, layered like the scales of something enormous sliding across the heavens. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it in her skin, in the metallic taste at the back of her throat, in the way her broken fingers ached with a sudden, vicious intensity that had nothing to do with effort. Down in the valley, she could see movement in Briar Gulch, tiny figures rushing between buildings, carrying loads of firewood, leading horses into barns. The town was battening down. Word had come through the telegraph, or maybe it hadn't. Maybe it was just the sky itself delivering its message in a language older than Morse code. Something was coming. Something that the mountain had been preparing for all autumn, gathering its strength in the northern peaks, building, waiting for the moment to descend. Wren brought her last bundle of firewood inside, checked the door seal, checked the chimney, filled her water jug from the spring, which was already beginning to ice over at the edges. She lit a candle, placed it on the table, lit the stove a small fire, conservative, just enough to take the edge off the air. She sat on her stool, her cup of weak coffee in her good hand, her broken fingers resting in her lap. The shelter was quiet. The candle burned straight. The earthen walls breathed their slow, steady warmth. Above her, the turf roof, the granite slabs, the packed clay layers of insulation between her body, the sky. She was as ready as she would ever be. Outside, the first flakes fell, soft, almost hesitant, drifting down through the still air like ash from a distant fire. They landed on the turf roof, on the stone walls, on the dead grass of the slope, dissolving into nothing. A gentle overture, almost playful, an introduction to what was coming. Then the light failed. The pewter sky darkened to iron. The iron darkened to something beyond color, a void, a negation of light itself. The flakes thickened. The bone scythe woke. It did not return as a moan or a whisper or any of its previous voices. It came back as a scream, a sustained, full-throated shriek of pure elemental fury that hit the mountain like a fist. The snow, which had been falling vertically, went horizontal. A white wall of ice particles driven at velocities that could strip bark from a tree. The temperature plummeted through the floor of anything the living had a right to expect. The storm had arrived. Inside her shelter, 3 feet below the surface, Wren Mercer heard it as a distant roar, muffled, contained, reduced by earth, stone, turf, to the sound of something happening in another world. The candle flame did not move. The stove ticked quietly. The walls held. She sipped her coffee. She waited. The storm did not rage. Rage implies emotion, implies a beginning, a peak, a resolution. What descended on Gallows Peak in the first week of December 1883 was something closer to erasure, a systematic, methodical obliteration of the visible world that operated with the patience of geology rather than the fury of weather. The bone scythe drove the snow horizontally across the ridgeline in sheets so dense they were indistinguishable from solid matter. A white wall moving at 50, 60 miles per hour, scouring exposed rock, burying fence posts, erasing trails, turning the familiar topography of the mountain into a featureless void. In Briar Gulch, the storm hit the valley with a violence that exceeded living memory. The oldest residents, men who had survived the blizzard of 1871, who wore that survival like a badge of territorial aristocracy, stood at their windows watching the sky dissolve, their faces carrying an expression that their grandchildren had never seen before. Fear. Not the manageable fear of a hard winter, but the deep ancestral recognition that this storm belonged to a different category entirely. This was not weather, this was judgment. The wooden houses of the town, structures that had seemed solid enough in autumn, revealed themselves as what they truly were: thin shells of dead wood perched on the frozen skin of the earth, exposed on every side to a force that found weakness with the precision of water finding cracks in stone. The wind drove snow through window frames, under doors, through gaps between planks that had been invisible until the storm made them catastrophic. Families woke on the first morning to find the inside surfaces of their walls coated with a fine, glittering frost. Fires that had been banked at midnight were roaring by 2 in the morning, consuming firewood at a rate that made careful men do desperate arithmetic. The heat rose to the ceiling, fought the cold pressing through the walls, lost ground inch by inch. Women draped quilts over windows. Men stuffed rags into every crevice they could reach. Children huddled together under piles of blankets, their breath visible in their own bedrooms. The noise was relentless, a sustained, multi-layered assault of screaming wind, creaking timber, the occasional rifle shot crack of a branch or board giving way. Sleep was impossible. Conversation required shouting. The storm created a strange, compressed intimacy in each household. Families pressed together in the warmest corner of the room, maintaining their fire with the focused attention of people tending a life support system, which is precisely what it was. By the second day, the first casualties were reported. The Dawson barn, half a mile south of town, collapsed under the weight of snow accumulating on its roof. 14 head of cattle were trapped inside. The Dawsons could hear them bellowing but could not reach the barn through the drifts, which had piled to 8-10 feet against the south-facing walls. The cattle would survive, or they would not. There was nothing a human being could do about it. 3 miles east, the Ridley family's chimney cracked the mortar between the stones, weakened by years of freeze-thaw cycles, finally surrendering to the sustained pressure of the wind. Smoke filled their cabin. They had a choice: open the door to vent the smoke, admitting the killing cold, or close the flue, losing their heat source entirely. They chose the cold, spending the night wrapped in every textile they owned, their fire reduced to a pitiful smolder that consumed precious fuel while producing almost no warmth. Up the valley, on the opposite slope from Mule's Lament, Tolliver Hask sat in his farmhouse, a structure that had stood for 3 generations, built by his grandfather from lodgepole pine cut on the property, chinked with a mixture of clay, horsehair, lime. It was the sturdiest private dwelling in the region. It was failing. The wind was hitting the west-facing wall with a regularity that Tolliver, in his more lucid moments, recognized as resonance, the gusts arriving at a frequency that matched some structural harmonic of the timber frame, causing the entire wall to flex inward with each blow, a visible, sickening pulse. The window glass, real glass, shipped from St. Louis at considerable expense by his grandfather, had cracked in the upper right pane, admitting a thin, whistling jet of snow-laden air that was slowly coating the interior sill, the floor beneath it, the chair beside it, in a layer of white. He had stuffed the crack with a wool sock. The sock was already frozen solid. His fire was consuming wood at a rate he had never experienced. He was a careful man, a planner. He had stacked his winter supply, 4 cords of seasoned pine, enough for 3 months, inside the woodshed attached to the north wall of the house. On the first morning of the storm, he had measured the pile with his eye, done the calculation. At the current rate of consumption, he had 3 weeks, perhaps 4. By the second evening, he revised the estimate downward. The cold was deeper, more penetrating than anything in his experience. His fire, which normally heated the 2-room cabin to a comfortable warmth, could not push the temperature above a range that made his breath visible. The heat was being extracted through the walls faster than the flames could replace it. On the evening of the second day, with the storm showing no sign of abating, Tolliver sat in his chair beside the fire, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that was cooling faster than he could drink it, thinking about the woman on the mountain. He had thought about her intermittently since the storm began. At first the thoughts were practical, almost clinical, the kind of inventory a farmer takes of distant livestock during a storm. She was probably dead. No tent could survive this wind. If she had made it into that hole she was digging, she might last longer. The earth would shield her from the wind, but without enough fuel, without a proper door, the cold would find her. He pictured her frozen body, curled in the fetal position at the bottom of her excavation, dusted with blown snow. He felt the weight of that image in his chest, not guilt exactly, because he had offered help, had been refused. Something adjacent to guilt, something that tasted like failure. But as the hours passed, as his own house groaned under the assault, as his own fire struggled against a cold that seemed to have the weight of the entire atmosphere behind it, the image shifted. He remembered standing at the edge of her excavation, looking down at the muddy pit, pronouncing it a grave. He remembered the day he had lent her barley, the mule returning sound, well cared for, which told him something about the woman's character that his words would never have extracted. He remembered her voice, quiet, certain. The last time they had spoken, the earth does hold warmth. He thought about the physics of it. Tolliver Hask was not an educated man. He had attended school through the 4th grade before the realities of frontier farming pulled him out, but he possessed the deep, intuitive understanding of natural systems that comes from a lifetime of working with soil, water, weather, living things. He understood insulation. He packed straw around his water pipes every autumn because straw trapped dead air, because dead air was a poor conductor of heat. His root cellar maintained a steady temperature year-round, cool in summer, above freezing in winter because the earth surrounding it absorbed temperature extremes, the way a sponge absorbs water, slowly, massively, releasing it back with the same patient gradualism. Her shelter was a root cellar with a stove, the earth around it, insulated now by the very snow that was trying to kill him, would hold its temperature like a stone holds the sun's warmth after sunset. The wind that was tearing his house apart could not reach her. The cold that was draining his firewood could not penetrate 3 feet of packed earth. She would need only the smallest fire, a handful of the scrub sticks he had dismissed, as kindling to raise the interior temperature to something livable. The realization arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, grinding rearrangement of his assumptions, tectonic plates of understanding shifting beneath the surface of his thinking. She was not crazy. She had never been crazy. She had been right, in the way that obvious truths are right, so simple, so fundamental, that everyone walks past them looking for something more complicated. He took a long drink of his cooling coffee. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, his house shivered. He did not sleep that night. He fed the fire. He listened to the wind, he thought. On the morning of the 3rd day, the sound came. Not the wind, not the creaking of the frame, something sharper, louder, more final. A sound like a gunshot, followed by a long, splintering crack that seemed to travel through the bones of the house itself. The main ridge beam, the central spine of the roof, a 12-inch lodgepole pine that his grandfather had selected, peeled, fitted with the pride of a man building something to outlast him, had split. The accumulated weight of 3 days of snow, compacted by wind into a dense, ice-heavy mass, had exceeded the timber's tolerance. The crack ran from the center of the beam toward the east wall, opening a gap in the roof sheathing through which snow immediately began to pour, a steady cascade of white powder falling into the attic, onto the stored goods, the dried provisions, the spare blankets. Within minutes, the attic floor was sagging under the new weight. Within an hour, flakes were sifting through the ceiling boards into the main room, melting in the heat of the fire, dripping onto the table, the bed, the floor. Tolliver's house was dying. He could hear it in the timbers, the low, continuous groaning of wood under stress, a sound he recognized from watching trees fall. Once the ridge beam split, the rest was arithmetic. The rafters, designed to transfer their load to the beam, were now carrying weight they were never meant to bear. They would hold for hours, maybe a day. Then they would fail, one after another, in a cascading collapse that would bring the entire roof down into the living space. His firewood was nearly gone. 3 days of desperate burning had consumed what should have lasted weeks. The pile in the woodshed, which had reached nearly to the ceiling, was now a thin scattering of bark, sawdust, a few knotty pieces too twisted to split. He had perhaps 6 hours of fuel remaining. After that, no fire. After that, the cold already winning would claim the house entirely. He stood in his kitchen, his breath pluming in the air of his own home, snow falling gently through the cracked ceiling onto the table where he had eaten 10,000 meals. He was 63 years old. He was alone. His wife was dead. His children, 2 sons, both gone to Oregon. Drawn by promises of milder weather, easier land had not written since spring. If his roof collapsed, if his fire died, no one would find him until the spring thaw. He would be a story told in Briar Gulch for a generation. The old farmer who froze in his own kitchen. A cautionary tale, the kind this territory specialized in producing. The thought of Wren returned. Not as a flicker this time, as a flame, bright, urgent, impossible to ignore. Her shelter was less than a mile away, upslope, buried under snow. The distance under normal conditions was a 20-minute walk. Under these conditions, it might as well be 20 miles. The snow was waist-deep in the sheltered areas, deeper on the windward slopes. The wind was a physical barrier, a moving wall of ice particles that could knock a man off his feet, fill his lungs with frozen air, blind him within seconds. The temperature, though he had no way to measure it precisely, was well below zero. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes. A fall, an injury, a moment of disorientation, any of these would be fatal. He was probably going to die either way. Here, in his collapsing kitchen, the death was certain, merely slow. Out there, in the white chaos, the death was probable but not guaranteed. Between certain death with dignity in his own home, uncertain death in a blizzard with the faint possibility of survival, at the other end the choice was not a choice at all. It was a bet placed by a man who had nothing left to wager except the walking. He dressed with the methodical care of a man preparing for his own funeral. Every piece of clothing he owned: 2 wool shirts, a flannel undershirt, canvas overalls, a second pair of trousers pulled over the first. His heavy coat lined with sheepskin, the collar turned up, a wool scarf wrapped around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed, his hat pulled low, 2 pairs of socks inside his boots, the leather cracked but still waterproof. His heaviest gloves, ironically, the pair whose mates he had given to Wren weeks ago. He took up his walking stick, a piece of seasoned hickory, iron-tipped, that had been his companion on 1,000 trips across his property. He looked around his kitchen one last time. The fire was burning its final logs, casting a warm golden light that made the falling snow sparkle as it drifted through the cracked ceiling. It was, he thought, a beautiful way for a house to die. He opened the door. The storm hit him like a freight train. The wind drove the breath from his lungs, replaced it with a mouthful of ice crystals that burned his throat. The snow, driven horizontal, hit his exposed eyes like thrown sand, forcing them shut. He leaned into the gale, his body at a 45-degree angle, the walking stick plunging into the drift ahead of him like a blind man's cane. The world was gone. Not obscured, gone. There was no up, no down, no horizon, no landmarks. The snow erased everything, filling the air so completely that visibility dropped to less than the length of his outstretched arm. Direction was a memory, a calculation based on wind angle, slope gradient, the knowledge of his own land that was etched so deeply into his body it had become a form of proprioception. The wind was coming from the northwest. Mule's lament was northeast. He angled his body accordingly, trusting 60 years of reading this landscape to guide him through the void. The snow was thigh-deep in the first 100 yards, a heavy, wet powder that grabbed at his legs with each step, requiring a lifting, lunging motion that consumed enormous energy. He fell within the first 5 minutes, his boot catching on a buried fence post, pitching him forward into the drift. The snow closed over him instantly, a cold, white burial that packed into his collar, his sleeves, the gap between his scarf, his hat. He fought back to the surface, gasping, already exhausted. He walked, fell, rose, walked. The storm was a living opponent, adapting to his efforts, shifting its attacks. When he turned his face from the wind, it circled, found a new angle. When he paused to catch his breath, it piled snow against his legs, anchoring him, trying to hold him still long enough for the cold to finish the job. His fingers, inside the heavy gloves, lost sensation, first the tips going numb, then the knuckles, then the palms. His feet followed, the cold creeping upward from his toes like water rising in a well. The journey that should have taken 20 minutes consumed nearly 2 hours. He navigated by instinct, by the slope of the ground beneath the snow, by the angle of the wind against his right cheek. Twice he nearly walked off the edge of a ravine, catching himself at the last moment when the ground beneath his feet tilted sharply, the snow giving way to empty air. Once he stopped, completely disoriented, unable to determine whether he was moving toward Mule's lament or away from it, the white void offering no clue, no reference point, nothing but the howling, formless, directionless chaos. He almost quit. The temptation was enormous, not as a decision but as a surrender, a simple cessation of effort. His body was failing. His legs moved with the mechanical, graceless motion of a machine running out of fuel. His arms, holding the walking stick, trembled with fatigue rather than cold. The rational part of his mind, the farmer's mind that calculated odds, assessed conditions, made practical decisions, was telling him what he already knew. He had gambled. He had lost. The merciful thing now would be to lie down, let the snow cover him, let the cold do its quick, final work. Then his boot hit stone, not the rounded, scattered stones of the open slope, a flat, vertical surface, a wall. He dropped to his knees, his gloved hands fumbling along the stonework, tracing the familiar dry-laid pattern he had watched Wren build from a distance, the retaining wall of her entrance. He crawled along it, his face inches from the stone, snow plastering his back, his hat filling the creases of his coat. His hand found the edge of the wall, turned the corner, encountered wood, planks, rough nail-studded planks. The door, he hammered on it with his fist. The sound was pathetic, a weak, padded thumping, absorbed by the wood, the snow, the roaring wind. His voice, when he tried to use it, produced a croak that did not carry past his own scarf. He pulled the scarf down, exposing his mouth to the searing cold. Wren. The word came out as a rasp, snatched away by the gale, thrown down the slope to be buried under 1,000,000 tons of falling snow. No response, no light through the cracks in the door, no sound from inside. Despair, the real thing, not the abstract concept but the physical sensation, a cold heavier than the storm itself, settling into his chest like a stone dropped into a well. She was dead. The shelter had failed. He had fought his way up a mountain in a killing blizzard, to die on the doorstep of a frozen tomb. He slumped against the door, his back to the wood, his legs folding beneath him. The snow began to accumulate on his shoulders, his lap. He could feel himself disappearing, becoming part of the landscape. Another stone on the mountainside to be uncovered in spring. The door moved, not much, half an inch perhaps, scraping against his back. He pitched sideways, caught himself on his elbow. The door opened inward, revealing a rectangle of golden light candlelight, warm, steady, impossibly bright after hours in the white void. A wave of air washed over his face. It smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, earth, warmth. Wren stood in the doorway, holding a candle, her face calm, her eyes widening as she took in the snow-caked apparition slumped against her threshold. She did not speak. She stepped back, pulling the door wide, making room. He crawled inside on his hands, his knees, a grown man reduced to the mechanics of an infant, dragging himself across the stone threshold into the small, warm, quiet space that existed in absolute defiance of everything happening outside. She closed the door behind him. The storm vanished, not gradually, instantly, completely, as if someone had thrown a switch. The screaming wind became a distant hum. The driving snow became silence. The cold, the terrible, bone-deep, soul-killing cold that had been dismantling him molecule by molecule for 2 hours was replaced by a warmth so gentle, so steady, so profoundly present that it felt like being held. He lay on the packed earth floor shaking, not from cold alone, from the release of tension, from the shock of transition, from the overwhelming, disorienting fact of being alive. His body, which had been operating in a state of emergency, flooding itself with the chemistry of survival, did not know how to stop. He shook the way a man shakes after a near drowning, the involuntary tremors of a system recalibrating itself to the improbable condition of continued existence. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, pressed a tin mug of hot tea into his hands. He could not feel the heat through his frozen gloves, could not grip the mug with his wooden fingers. She held it for him, tilting it to his lips, the way one feeds a child, without embarrassment, without ceremony. The liquid burned a line of warmth down his throat into his stomach, a lit fuse running through the core of him. He looked around the space. The candle on the table burned without movement, its flame a perfect yellow teardrop pointed at the ceiling. The small stove radiated a modest warmth, a few sticks of scrub wood glowing through the open grate, barely more than a campfire, producing a heat that would have been laughable in his farmhouse, but here, in this insulated chamber, maintained a temperature comfortable enough to sit in shirt sleeves. The earthen walls had a solidity that transcended architecture. They were not walls in the human sense, not barriers erected against the elements. They were the elements, redirected, enlisted, put to work. He tried to speak. His jaw was locked, the muscles frozen into a rictus that would not yield to his will. He worked it open by degrees, the tendons cracking. his teeth chattering violently. How? The single syllable was all he could manage. A question so compressed by cold exhaustion, disbelief that it contained everything he needed to ask. How is this possible? How did you know? How are you alive? How was I wrong? Wren looked around her shelter, the earthen walls, the stone ceiling, the small stove with its modest fire, the candle that burned without flickering in the windless air. She did not explain the thermodynamics. She did not cite her grandmother's wisdom, or the ancient earth lodge, or the warm breath she had felt rising from the cavity beneath the old bothy's foundation. The evidence was all around them, needing no translation, no argument, no defense. They were warm while the world froze. The explanation was the room itself. I listened. He stared at her. Then he closed his eyes, leaned his head back against the earthen wall, felt the slow, steady warmth of the mountain pressing against his skull. Something released in his chest, a knot he had been carrying. For so long he had forgotten it was there. A tightness made of grief, loneliness, the accumulated weight of winters survived through brute force rather than understanding. His eyes burned. He let them. She gave him soup, hot, thick, made from dried beans, potatoes, a handful of wild herbs she had foraged before the storm. He ate slowly, his swollen fingers barely able to hold the spoon. The warmth spread through him from the inside out, meeting the warmth of the room pressing in from the outside, until the boundary between his body, the food, the shelter, the earth itself seemed to dissolve. He was not inside a building. He was inside the mountain. The mountain was keeping him alive. Over the next 2 days, while the storm continued its siege above them, Wren tended to his injuries. His left hand was the worst. The fingers had gone white, then gray, the skin waxy, hard. Frostbite, severe. She warmed them gradually, immersing them in water heated just above body temperature, a process she had read about in one of Amos's old medical pamphlets. The pain when sensation returned was extraordinary. Tolliver, a man who had set his own broken collarbone without a sound, clenched his jaw so hard she heard his teeth crack. 2 fingers on his left hand pwned the ring finger. The pinky did not recover. The tissue was dead, blackened by the 3rd day, the smell of gangrene beginning to seep through the bandages she wrapped around them. She told him plainly, the fingers would have to come off or the infection would spread. She had a knife, sharp enough. She had whiskey, a small bottle she had found in Herschel's old supplies, hidden in a crevice of the bothy foundation. She had clean cloth for bandages. She did not have laudanum, ether, expertise, or the luxury of waiting for a doctor who could not reach them through 10 feet of snow. Tolliver looked at his blackened fingers, looked at the knife, looked at her. His voice, restored by 2 days of warmth, food, rest, carried a new quality, not gratitude exactly, something rawer, something closer to recognition. You saved my life by being the person everyone said was crazy. I reckon the least I can do is let you take my fingers. He drank the whiskey in 2 swallows, gripped the edge of the table with his good hand, nodded. She worked quickly. He did not scream. The sound he made was more private than a scream, a low, sustained exhalation through clenched teeth, an animal sound, the sound of a body enduring what the mind has consented to. She cauterized the stumps with the flat of the knife heated in the stove, bandaged them with strips of clean cloth boiled in water. The operation took less than 10 minutes. It bound them together in a covenant deeper than friendship, more intimate than any contract, the irreversible exchange of flesh, pain, trust. The storm broke on the 5th day. The bone scythe exhausted itself sometime before dawn, the screaming subsiding to a moan, the moan to a whisper, the whisper to silence. When Wren opened the door, the world outside was unrecognizable. The snow had buried everything, the slope, the scrub, the stones, the landscape itself, replaced by a smooth white, featureless expanse that glittered under a sky so blue it seemed artificial. The drifts against the entrance wall had piled to 6 feet, but the stone snow fence she had built before the storm had done its work, creating a wind shadow that kept the door itself accessible. She dug a path outward. The air was still, crystalline, so cold it burned her lungs. The sun was blinding on the snow. She stood on the surface, looking down the valley toward Briar Gulch, where thin columns of smoke marked the houses that still had fuel to burn. Some chimneys were dark. The damage revealed itself over the following days as the community began to dig. 3 roofs had collapsed entirely. A dozen more were damaged. Nearly half the valley's livestock had perished frozen in barns, buried in drifts, lost in the white void. The Dawson cattle were dead. The Ridley cabin was uninhabitable. An elderly couple, the Petersons, who lived at the far eastern edge of town, had been found by their neighbors in a state of severe hypothermia, their fire dead, their woodpile exhausted. They were carried to the church, wrapped in blankets, fed broth, their survival uncertain for 3 days before the old woman's eyes opened, followed a day later by her husband's. They would recover, but slowly, bearing the scars of frostbite on their extremities for the rest of their lives. The story of Tolliver Hask's survival spread through Briar Gulch with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve, faster than telegraph, more detailed than newspaper, embellished at each retelling but needing no embellishment because the bare facts were extraordinary enough. Tolliver himself told the story with the fervor of a convert, cornering anyone who would listen in the general store, the saloon, the church vestibule. He held up his bandaged hand, the missing fingers a testament no one could argue with. That woman survived the worst storm in 30 years with a handful of sticks, while the rest of us nearly froze to death, surrounded by cordwood stacked to the ceiling. Her shelter was warmer than my house, warmer than this store, warmer than the church. Not because she had more fuel, because she had more sense. He took them up the mountain. A procession of 8 men, their boots crunching through the crusted snow, their faces red with cold, climbed the trail to Mule's Lament on a clear morning a week after the storm. They stood at the entrance to her shelter, hats in hands, looking at the low stone doorway, the turf roof indistinguishable from the surrounding slope. Several of them had walked over the shelter on their way up, without realizing it was there. Wren stood at the entrance. Not inviting them in, the space was too small for a crowd, but allowing them to look, to feel the warmth drifting from the open door, to see the candle burning steady in the windless interior. She answered their questions simply, without pride, without the need to convince. The earth insulates. Snow is a blanket. Working with the mountain costs less than working against it. The knowledge was not hers, it belonged to the people who had lived here before any of them arrived, the people whose Earth Lodge posts she had found buried in the same soil. Judson Mercer stood at the back of the group. His face was the color of tallow, a sickly yellow-white that had nothing to do with the cold. He watched the men's faces as they examined Wren's shelter, watched their expressions shift from curiosity to understanding to a respect that rearranged everything he had built, every whisper, every insinuation, every careful stroke of the brush with which he had painted her as a madwoman. His narrative was collapsing faster than the roofs in the valley. He tried. Lucky break is all. One storm doesn't prove anything. That hole will flood come spring. Mark my words. She's still got no proper habitation under the law. My claim stands. Tolliver turned on him. The old farmer had lost 2 fingers, 15 pounds, most of his illusions about his own competence. What he had gained was a clarity that cut through pretense like the bone scythe cut through wool. His voice carried across the group with an authority that 40 years of quiet farming had earned him. This woman survived with a handful of sticks while good men nearly froze surrounded by cord upon cord of firewood. That is not luck. That is wisdom, the kind you cannot buy, Judson, the kind you have to earn. Judson's mouth opened, closed. He looked at the faces of the men around him, men who had respected him, deferred to him, accepted his version of events. He saw no allies. He saw men whose own houses had nearly killed them, who were standing at the entrance to a shelter that had done what their homes could not. The mathematics of credibility had shifted, irreversibly. He left without speaking. His boots punched through the crusted snow as he descended the trail, each step carrying him further from the influence he had spent years cultivating. But Judson Mercer was not a man who accepted defeat as a permanent condition. Within a week of the procession, he rode to Helena through snow-choked passes, pushing his horse to the edge of endurance. He had an appointment with the Territorial Land Office. He had documents. He had a surveyor's report, commissioned the previous summer, identifying significant copper deposits on the eastern shoulder of Gallows Peak, specifically on the 40-acre parcel deeded to Wren Mercer. The hearing was scheduled for mid-March, when the passes reopened. Judson filed his claim under two provisions: abandonment of surface improvement, arguing that a dugout did not constitute legitimate habitation under territorial law; improperly maintained homestead, arguing that the parcel showed no agricultural or commercial development. He requested transfer of the deed to himself as nearest family claimant, with the stated intention of developing the mineral rights. Word reached Briar Gulch through the telegraph in late January. Wren learned of it from Tolliver, who had heard it from the telegraph operator, who had heard it from a clerk in Helena, who owed Tolliver a favor from a Long Ago cattle deal. The legal language was dense, bureaucratic, designed to obscure its essential purpose: a man with connections, using the machinery of territorial government to take land from a woman without them. The winter passed. Wren's shelter held. The earth maintained its steady temperature while blizzards came again. Her fuel supply, the pitiful bundle of sticks that Tolliver had once dismissed as kindling, lasted the entire season, supplemented by occasional foraging expeditions on clear days. She ate her stored provisions carefully, stretching the beans, the flour, the dried goods. Tolliver's weekly offerings continued appearing at the bottom of the trail even in heavy snow, left by a man who now climbed the mountain to deliver them personally, who sat in her shelter drinking coffee, his bandaged hand resting on the table, discussing the coming hearing with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. March arrived with the grudging thaw that Montana offered as its version of spring snow, retreating in patches, revealing brown grass, mud, the first tentative suggestions of green. The passes opened. The territorial judge, a man named Harwick, rode into Briar Gulch on a gray horse, accompanied by a clerk carrying a leather case of documents. The hearing was held in the town hall, a single-room building that served as church, meeting house, courtroom, dance hall, depending on the day. The room was full. Every seat occupied, men standing along the walls, women watching from the doorway. Briar Gulch had not seen a legal proceeding this interesting since a cattle rustler was tried, convicted, nearly hanged from the telegraph pole before cooler heads intervened. Judson sat at a table on the left, his surveyor's report spread before him, a lawyer from Helena beside him, a thin, precise man in a city suit who looked at the mud-floored town hall with the expression of someone who had been promised better. Wren sat on the right, alone. She had no lawyer, no documents beyond the original deed, no understanding of territorial property law beyond what common sense provided. She had her hands still bearing the calluses, the scars of months of labor. She had the deed. She had waiting outside in the cold spring air Tolliver Hask, too agitated to sit, pacing the boardwalk with his three-fingered hand shoved in his coat pocket. The surveyor testified first. His report was professional, detailed, accompanied by maps, soil samples, assay results. The eastern shoulder of Gallows Peak contained a copper vein of significant commercial potential. Preliminary estimates suggested deposits worth, at current market prices, in excess of $50,000. The room stirred at the number of figures so far beyond the daily economics of Briar Gulch that it belonged to a different world, the world of railroad barons, mining magnates, the kind of wealth that warped everything it touched. Wren listened. The copper explained everything: Judson's hunger, his persistence, his $40 offer, his $60 offer, his legal maneuvering. He had known since before Amos died, perhaps. The surveyor had been hired the previous summer, months before the auction, before the debt, before any of it. Judson had been positioning himself, waiting for the land to fall into his hands through the natural course of his brother's financial collapse. Amos's death had merely accelerated the timeline. She thought about the mining tools in the cave, the old pry bar, the pulleys, the drill bits. Prospectors had been on that slope before decades ago, perhaps contemporaneous with Herschel's tenure. Had Herschel known about the copper? Was that why he had stayed? Why he had endured 20 years of isolation on ground everyone else considered cursed? Another question that would never be answered. Another thread in the pattern that connected her to this place through channels deeper than legal documents. Judson's lawyer made his case with the efficiency of a man billing by the hour. The homestead provisions were clear. Improvement required visible, permanent structure. dug out a hole in the ground did not meet the standard. The claimant had made no agricultural use of the land, no commercial development, no effort consistent with the intent of the homestead provisions. The land should be transferred to a party prepared to develop its resources for the benefit of the territory. Judge Harwick listened, his face revealing nothing. He was a lean man, weathered, with the patient eyes of someone accustomed to separating substance from performance. He turned to Wren. She did not argue law. She did not cite provisions or precedents. She told him what she had done. She described the shelter, its construction, its dimensions, its performance during the storm. She described the Earth's thermal properties in the plain language of a woman who had discovered them not through books, but through her own freezing hands. She described the ancient Earth Lodge posts she had found, the proof that her method of habitation predated every wooden structure in the territory by centuries. Harwick's expression shifted a subtle rearrangement, interest replacing neutrality. Tolliver was called. He entered the room with the contained energy of a man who had been waiting for this moment, with the patience of a farmer waiting for rain. He walked to the front, turned to face the room, held up his left hand. The bandage was off. The two stumps, healed now to smooth, pink scars, were visible to everyone in the room. I lost these fingers getting to her shelter in the storm. I lost them because my own house, a house built the way every house in this valley is built, was falling apart around me. The roof cracked. The fire couldn't keep up. I was going to freeze to death in a building my grandfather put up with his own two hands. He paused, letting the room absorb the image. I walked a mile through the worst blizzard in living memory because I had nowhere else to go. When she opened that door, the air that came out was warm. Her candle was burning steady. She had soup on the stove. She saved my life with a shelter that every person in this room called a grave. He turned to Judson. The old farmer's voice dropped, carrying a weight that the courtroom's silence amplified. You sat in your warm store, Judson, spreading stories about a crazy woman digging her own hole. You knew about the copper. You knew before your brother was cold in the ground. You let her starve, let her freeze, let the whole town laugh at her because you figured the mountain would do your dirty work for you. The mountain would kill her. The deed would come loose. The copper would be yours. Except she didn't die. She listened to the mountain instead of fighting it, which is more than any man in this room can claim. Including me. Silence. The kind of silence that has texture, that presses against the walls, that makes people aware of their own breathing. Judge Harwick ruled the deed was valid. The shelter constituted legitimate, permanent habitation, more permanent. He noted with the faintest suggestion of a smile, then several wooden structures in the valley that had failed to survive the very storm in question. The claim of abandonment was dismissed. The mineral rights belonged to the deed holder, Wren Mercer. The room exhaled. Judson's lawyer began packing his case before the ruling was fully spoken, the practiced retreat of a professional who recognized a lost cause. Judson sat motionless, his face drained of expression, a man watching the architecture of his scheme collapse with the same finality as the roofs in the valley. He left through the side door, avoiding the main aisle, avoiding the eyes of men who had once deferred to him. He would remain in Briar Gulch, his store, his cattle interests, his seat on the land commission, but the authority he had wielded, the social weight that had allowed him to shape the town's perception of a grieving widow into a convenient narrative of madness, was broken, not destroyed, diminished permanently, in the way that a cracked beam is permanently weakened even if it continues to hold. Wren walked out of the town hall into the spring air. The snow was retreating up the slopes, revealing brown grass, patches of bare earth, the first crocuses pushing through the mud with an optimism that seemed, for the first time, justified. Tolliver fell into step beside her, his three-fingered hand in his pocket. They walked in silence for a while. Then Tolliver spoke, his voice carrying the rough gentleness of a man unused to saying important things. $50,000 in copper. That's a life, Wren. A real life. Down in the valley in a proper house. You could go anywhere. She had been thinking about this since the surveyor's testimony. $50,000. The number was abstract, almost meaningless. She had spent the winter surviving on beans, scrub wood, the warmth of the earth. Money existed in a different universe from the one she had been inhabiting, a universe of transactions, values, the exchange of one thing for another. The copper was in the ground beneath her shelter. Extracting it would mean digging not her kind of digging, not the careful, respectful excavation of a woman making a home. Mining, blasting, the systematic destruction of the very earth that had saved her life. The shelter would be gone. The slope would be torn open, gutted, left as a wound in the mountainside. She thought about Herschel, 20 years on that mountain, alone, sitting on a fortune he had apparently chosen not to extract. Maybe he had been crazy. Or maybe he had understood something that the surveyors, the lawyers, the men who measured value in dollars per ton could not comprehend. Some things are worth more whole than broken open. Some treasures lose their value the moment you try to spend them. The copper stays where it is. Tolliver stopped walking, stared at her. The earth kept me alive, Tolliver. It held me when nothing else would. I will not tear it apart to get rich. The warmth in that ground is worth more than any metal inside it. He was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded, a single slow movement, the gesture of a man adjusting his understanding of the world to accommodate a truth he had not expected to encounter. He resumed walking. Neither of them spoke again till they reached the bottom of the trail to Mule's Lament, where 3 families were waiting. The Dawsons, who had lost their barn, their cattle, most of their savings. The Ridleys, whose cabin was uninhabitable. A young couple named Pratt, newly married, who had been living with relatives since the storm destroyed the half-built cabin they had been raising on the valley floor. They stood in a loose group, their hats in their hands, their faces carrying the particular expression of people who have come to ask for something they are not sure they have the right to request. The eldest Dawson spoke for the group. Could she show them? Could she teach them what she had done? They had seen the shelter. They had felt the warmth. They wanted to build their own. Not on Mule's Lament. They were not asking for her land. On their own parcels, their own slopes. They wanted the knowledge. Wren looked at them. 6 months ago, these were the people who had bid on the fragments of her life at auction, who had whispered about her in Pickering's store, who had called her the mole woman with the casual cruelty of people who believed they knew what sanity looked like. Now they stood before her with their hats in their hands, asking to learn from the woman they had pitied. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication, though she had earned both. What she felt was simpler, older, closer to the bone. She felt useful. She felt necessary. She felt the specific warmth of being needed, a warmth different from the earth's, more fragile, more precious. She showed them. Through the spring, into the summer, she worked alongside each family, walking their land, reading the slopes, finding the spots where the earth breathed warmest. She taught them what she had learned: the drainage, the stone selection, the dry wall technique, the angle of the entrance, the thickness of the turf cover. She shared every mistake she had made, every collapse, every miscalculation, because the mistakes were the most valuable part of the knowledge. Anyone could copy a design. Understanding why it failed, how to correct it, how to read the mountain's feedback, that was the education that could not be extracted from a diagram. 3 earth-sheltered homes rose on the slopes around Briar Gulch that summer, their turf roofs greening in the July sun, their interiors cool while the wooden houses in the valley baked. By autumn, 2 more families had begun excavation. The following winter, milder than the one before, as if the mountain had made its point, the shelters performed flawlessly. Fuel consumption dropped to a fraction of what the valley's wooden homes required. No roofs collapsed. No fires went out. Mule's Lament was no longer a punchline. It was an address. Years passed. The community grew slowly, organically, the way things grow when they are not forced. Earth-sheltered homes dotted the slopes of Gallows Peak, their turf roofs blending with the meadows in summer, disappearing under snow in winter, each one a small act of agreement between a human being, the mountain, Wren's original shelter, the desperate hole dug by a widow with a pickaxe, a broken hand, a dead man's deed, became the center of this quiet revolution. People came to see it from other valleys, other territories. They came expecting a spectacle. They found a door in a hillside, a warm room, a woman who spoke about the earth the way some people speak about a friend who has never let them down. Tolliver Hask became her closest companion, not a husband, not a lover, but something the English language does not have a precise word for: a witness. A man who had crawled through her door half dead, who had lost 2 fingers to the journey, who had stood in a courtroom holding up his maimed hand as proof of what she had built. He moved his cattle operation to the slope below her shelter, built his own earth home with her guidance. They shared meals, tools, the comfortable silence of 2 people who have survived something together that neither could have survived alone. The copper remained in the ground. Wren never spoke of it publicly, never filed a mining claim, never invited a surveyor to assess the deposits that the territorial hearing had revealed to the world. Judson knew. The territory knew. Speculators wrote letters, made offers, sent representatives up the trail to Mule's Lament with contracts, promises, numbers that grew larger with each visit. She turned them all away with the same quiet refusal she had given Judson on the steps of her auctioned home, polite, firm, final. Some called her a fool for leaving $50,000 in the dirt. She did not argue. The earth that held the copper also held the warmth that had saved her life, saved Tolliver's life, was saving the lives of every family in the growing community. To tear it open for metal was to destroy the thing that made the metal irrelevant. Value, she had learned, was not a number. It was a relationship. The earth had offered her its warmth without conditions. She would not repay that gift with violence. Decades passed. The woman who had arrived on Gallows Peak with a worthless deed, a wooden chest, $17, grew old in the place she had dug with her own bleeding hands. Her hair turned silver. Her body, once lean with deprivation, settled into the sturdy, compact frame of a woman who had spent her life working with stone, soil, the patient materials of the earth. Her hands scarred, calloused, 2 fingers on the left slightly crooked, from the break that had never been properly set, remained strong. She used them every spring to help new families dig their foundations, to teach the next generation the art of dry stone walling, to press her palm against the exposed earth of a freshly cut slope, feeling for that slow, warm breath that had changed her life on a desperate autumn afternoon. The story of her first winter became the founding myth of the community, told by the fire on cold nights, passed from parents to children, embellished in the details but faithful in its essence. It was a story about the nature of value, about the difference between what the world tells you something is worth, what it actually provides. It was a lesson taught not through words but through the steady, unshakable evidence of the homes themselves, warm in winter, cool in summer, standing long after the wooden houses in the valley below had rotted, collapsed, been rebuilt, collapsed again. On the last evening of her life, Wren Mercer sat at the same table where she had pressed a mug of tea into Tolliver's frozen hands 40 years before. The candle burned steady, the stove ticked, the earthen walls breathed their ancient warmth. Through the open door, she could see the slope below, a scatter of turf roofs in the evening light, smoke rising from a dozen chimneys, the sound of children playing somewhere down the hill, their voices carried up the slope by the bone scythe, which still blew, still cut, still earned its name, but could not reach inside these walls, had never been able to reach inside these walls. She closed her eyes, pressed her palm against the earth beside her, feeling the pulse she had felt on the first day, the slow heartbeat of the mountain, the secret summer that had saved a desperate woman who had nothing left but the willingness to listen. The greatest treasures are not the ones that glitter in the light. They are the ones buried in the dark, patient, constant, waiting for a hand brave enough to dig a heart, humble enough to trust what the earth has been since long before we learned to build our walls against it. The candle burned. The earth held its warmth. Outside, the wind carried the sound of children home,